Welcome back, fellow football fanatics. This is College Football with Sam, and the regular season is over. And it was a very entertaining regular season, a very fun regular season. A regular season that, at least from my perspective, was fairly unpredictable. I started off pretty strong, but as the year went on, I think that things got confusing because all the teams at the top, and I think yesterday showed this with Georgia beating Texas 22-19 in overtime, Clemson crushing SMU early but nearly choking and then needing a 50-plus yard field goal to win the game, and Penn State and Oregon going back and forth, Oregon pretty much controlling the game, but there were opportunities for Penn State to take control. I think the teams at the top are all pretty close together. I don't think there is an alpha team, a single alpha team, at least in the type that we are used to in the 2024 season. There are some teams, of course, that I like, that I love to win the national championship, and we are going to talk about those teams today that are at least in the Big Ten Conference. We'll also talk about my opinion on what happened last night in Indianapolis between number 1 Oregon, who was victorious over number 3 Penn State. And I will also discuss my reaction to the college football playoff rankings and the seedings, and I'll show you the bracket from my graphic and talk about it and all of that good stuff. There's so much to talk about here, and I also want to do a little bit of, not a deep dive, but I want to look deeper into the Nittany Lions and the Ducks and spend a little extra time on them when it relates to their college football playoff paths, because Penn State got rewarded essentially for losing the Big Ten championship game. Oregon got punished, but you still have the bye, and that's very valuable. But Penn State has a red carpet to the national championship game. So we'll discuss all of that here. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, to like the video, to comment your thoughts down below in whichever way you can, whether you're on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Leave a 5-star review if you're on any of those services are able to. Also, share this channel around to others that you know. Hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when new content drops. And join our Discord server via the link in the video description, where we talk college football 24/7. We're close to 150 members, and I think with some things that I have planned these next 2 months for the playoff, we can reach 1,000 members in our Discord server and have it be active 24/7, 365, all talking about college football. And if you do want to apply to be a moderator in the Discord server, because we could always use more of those, you can email me by browsing my channel and looking for the section that has my email. You can find it pretty easily. So thank you for those things. If you want to support the channel monetarily, click the links down in the description to visit my merchandise store and purchase merchandise, or you can sign up as a paid member on the Patreon page. I'm actually wearing 2 College Football with Sam merchandise items right now. This black hoodie right here, and then an Oregon-themed College Football with Sam t-shirt right here, which, as you can tell by the fact that my green screen's glitching out, it is green. It's so green that the green screen can't tell the difference between my Oregon-themed College Football with Sam t-shirt, which you can still see is messing with everything, and my actual green screen behind me. So there's an Oregon-themed t-shirt, a Penn State one. There's themes for all 18 Big Ten teams where you can represent your Big Ten school and college football with Sam. Just check those out in the merchandise store. You can also send a super chat. Sending a super chat, what that'll do is allow me to answer your questions in a Q&A session that I will do sometime this week that will be up on all of my platforms. So let's dive right in and first and foremost react to the final college football playoff rankings. So, as usually follows conference championship week, the college football playoff bracket has been revealed, except this time it's not 4 teams that are included. It's 12 teams. The size of teams, the volume of teams that are competing for a national championship have tripled. Of course, I say that in quotations because not all of these teams can win it all. I think at best Slightly over half of them can win it all, and that's best case scenario. It may even be fewer teams than 6 or 7 that can win it all. Tomorrow, on Monday, on my Monday live show, what I will be doing is talking about my view on how to fix the college football playoff, and also some of my early analysis and opinions on the first round games. So click the notification bell so that you can get notified when I go live tomorrow afternoon, maybe late morning. We'll see what the timetable for that is. But a few thoughts before I show you the bracket. Or, you know what, to heck with it. I can show you the bracket right here and also right now. Whoops. Gotta move this. Gotta move this over here. A few thoughts. I think that the committee got it right. I think that when you look at, and by the committee got it right, I mean in relationship to Alabama. I think that Alabama is the classic tale of, yes, they're power rated high. Their highs are very high. They look like they can be an elite team at times. But at the end of the day, they lost to Oklahoma 24-3 on the road. They lost to Vandy on the road. Hypothetically, they could have lost to South Carolina. They also could have lost to Georgia. And they did lose to Tennessee. And Alabama is Tennessee's only good win. They lost to Arkansas on the road, got game controlled to death by Georgia on the road. I think that while in a more perfect system, again, which I will talk about tomorrow, at least in my opinion, it's a more perfect system. In a more perfect system, Alabama would get a shot. They would. But SMU would too, because SMU, they lost to BYU at home, and they also lost to Clemson, but those were one-score games. They beat the remainder of their opponents, and they reached the conference championship game. And really what the committee should have done, if they wanted to leave SMU out, is they should not have ranked SMU higher than Alabama to begin with, which is something that, I mean, at least the distance between those two teams in the CFP ratings last week was ridiculous. There was no way Alabama was that far behind SMU in placement. Maybe you could argue that SMU was better, but maybe by a placement or two, not by closer to 5 placements or whatever it was. It was a pretty sizable margin. And I don't think there was a way, unless Clemson blew out SMU, that was going to happen, where Alabama was going to leapfrog SMU. And initially, in the ACC championship game, it looked like that may have been the case. But at the end of the day, that didn't happen. SMU crawled their way back, and it was 31-31. And then Clemson marched down the field and kicked a, I think, 53-yard field goal, and that's why they're the 12th seed here, that you can see the bracket on your screen. But that's what I wanted to start this video off with, is talking about how I think that at the end of the day, don't lose to bad teams. Don't do that. Like Oklahoma could have gone 5-7, even if they beat Bama, if you flip the Houston game in Houston's favor, or Tulane makes their comeback, or, you know, Oklahoma doesn't beat Auburn on the road off of a pick 6. Those things that I'm talking about. Oklahoma's a bad football team who fired their offensive coordinator in the middle of the year. They basically are Wisconsin in a lot of ways, a team that Alabama destroyed earlier in the year. But Alabama instead got, well, destroyed by Oklahoma. It was 3-24. It wasn't close. Milroe looked awful in that game. I have no confidence that Jalen Milroe could read and dissect the majority of these defenses in the bracket. Tennessee's, he couldn't diagnose. Ohio State, who hosts Tennessee, I mean, they would tear apart Jalen Milroe. Oregon, I think the same thing. Texas, obviously. Indiana has one of the best rushing defenses in the country. They would do well. Same with Notre Dame. Same with Georgia. Same with Penn State. You're basically looking at Alabama's only chance on offense in a lot of ways to get sustainable success is against teams with traditionally G5 talent or who are actually Group of 5 schools. And maybe Clemson, because Clemson has had issues defending the run. Alabama Early in the year, it looked like one of college football's better teams, but they just slowly fell apart. And they don't deserve to be in, consequentially. But that's really the only opinion I had on these rankings that I wanted to showcase to you. Of course, the entire system is far from good. There's a lot of elements about it that I think are absolutely disastrous, such as Oregon having to play Ohio State or Tennessee. Meanwhile, Penn State, who lost the Big Ten championship game, gets to play SMU. Yes, it's an extra game. Then they play Boise State. Like, if they beat SMU. And then they play Georgia or Notre Dame or Indiana. And Penn State, well, they would not be anything more than a field goal underdog against any of those teams, outside of maybe Notre Dame, who power ratings really, really like. But even then, I don't know if they'd be more than a field goal underdog. Oregon's the number 1 team in the country, and they get the harder bracket. The top half of the bracket, as it is formatted on, ESPN, that's, Oregon's half of the bracket compared to Georgia's. Georgia's is the bottom half. Or on my screen, the screen that you're watching this on, the left side of the bracket is harder. You have Texas, you have Ohio State, you have Tennessee. Those are top 10 power-rated teams. Ohio State and Texas are top 3 power-rated, if not top 2, depending on where you look. Clemson is pretty good. And you also have Arizona State, who's been skyrocketing ever since November. On the right-hand side of the bracket, you have Indiana, who I think is top 10 in power ratings, and most power ratings would agree, but they're limited in talent. Notre Dame lost to a MAC school, and they have some limitations on their roster, even though they're more talented than, let's say, Indiana, and they've been dominant. Georgia may be playing with a backup QB because that injury to Carson Beck, where he couldn't bend his elbow, that's pretty serious. Boise State's a G5 school, probably the worst school in the college football playoff bracket. SMU is clearly, I think there's noted about it, they're not a top 10 team. Penn State is really up there with Georgia, Notre Dame, and Indiana. Top 10, could be top 5. But yeah, I think it's pretty clear that left hand, or depending on the format, top of the bracket, the half with Oregon is the harder half. It is. And I think that in a more perfect world, in a system where there's more consistency, for example, Ohio State probably gets the 7 seed over Notre Dame because, yes, the loss to Michigan at home was humiliating. Loss to Oregon on the road by a point is a second loss when Notre Dame only has 1. But Ohio State's played a tougher strength of schedule. And Notre Dame's loss to Miami of Ohio at home is infinitely worse than a loss to Michigan at home because Michigan would probably beat Miami of Ohio by multiple touchdowns because of that huge talent discrepancy. And in a more perfect world as well, Clemson's probably ranked ahead of SMU, and they play Penn State, and SMU plays Texas. I also think that would probably be kind of a more entertaining series of matchups there. I also think that Arizona State, in a more perfect world, probably gets the 3 seed over Boise State, who gets the 4 seed. Heck, in a more perfect world, Arizona State and Boise State don't even get buys. The buys are 1 Oregon, 2 Georgia, 3 Texas, and 4 Penn State. That's probably the perfect world here. Or maybe you think Notre Dame should, get a top 4 seed, and that the College Football Playoff Committee should have had them jump one of Texas or Penn State, or both of them, because Notre Dame has been very dominant outside of that loss to Miami of Ohio, which I think should blemish their resume. I think that should prevent them from being ranked higher than they are. But maybe you disagree, and your disagreement very well could be valid there. That's just my thoughts on this college football playoff bracket, and really how I see it is that it's a flawed system. I mean, that's all I'm going to say. I mean, think of Ohio State. People are talking about, and I think this is lunacy, that Ryan Day is going to be fired unless he wins it all. He has to beat Tennessee. He has to beat Oregon. He has to beat probably Texas, but maybe that Texas spot is taken by Clemson or Arizona State, who are still pretty good teams. And then in the Natty, he'll have to beat likely Penn State, Georgia, Notre Dame, or Indiana. He's going to have to go through 3 probably 3 top 10 or maybe even top 5 teams, and maybe even 4 top 10 teams with an offensive line that cannot run block. That's insanity. That's hard, and it should be hard because of the position that Ohio State put themselves in. But still, the system is flawed, and I use that as an example to say how hard Ohio State's path is, and Oregon has to go through a similar path. Not quite as hard because they play a fewer game, but they're the 1 seed. I think in the perfect world, they should play the 12th seed, or expand the playoff to 16, remove the byes, because I think that whole system sort of causes the imbalanced pathways to the playoff, and Oregon plays the 16th seed. They don't get a bye, but they play a team who they'd be favored by multiple touchdowns over, and at least they get the easiest first-round game. That would be a more just system for Oregon going 13-0 and being the only undefeated team in the country compared to what they have now. And then for Georgia, they play the 15th seed, and they get a better reward. And then you go on and on and on for that. And that system, which I'll talk more about tomorrow, has multiple different ways you could format it. You could reserve the top 4 seeds for the 4 best conference champions, but just have no byes and 16 teams participating overall. But that's a topic for another day. That's my reaction to the playoff bracket. I think that many of these games have a lot of intrigue to them. I'm curious to see how Arizona State and Boise State do, if they can take advantage of their byes, or if the teams, SMU, Penn State for Boise, or Clemson and Texas are just too much for them in terms of talent. I wonder how Oregon is going to handle their part of the bracket. And Indiana versus Notre Dame, it's an in-state game between 2 teams that don't play each other all that often. Both are going to be used to the weather, and these are 2 teams that have 1 loss, have faced very easy strength of schedules, but have also been extremely dominant. And then there's Tennessee and Ohio State, who have awesome potential on offense, and on defense, they're among the nation's best in efficiency. They have 1 ugly loss each and another loss on the road to a top 2 team in the country. So it's going to be very entertaining football. I'm excited to watch all these games, do preview and predictions for all of them. And yeah, welcome to the new world of college football, everyone. That's that right there. That's the 12-team college football playoff. Let me look in the chat here just to briefly read off some reactions. Armand Hammer says, "It's rigged," quote. "I'd rather have the bye. Injuries are a very real possibility," someone says. That's very true. I think that people are underestimating how, when you look at how the system's set up, they're underestimating how much of an advantage that extra week can be if the proper coach utilizes it. A coach like, let's say, James Franklin, who we'll be talking about in a few seconds, I don't know if I'd trust a coach like him to utilize that extra bye. And I'm dead serious when I say that, because it's another big game where he's made some pretty questionable decisions. But ultimately, that buys a huge advantage, because let's say Ohio State plays Tennessee, and Tennessee's a physical football team. Tennessee is a team that can benefit from being in the cold. Absolutely. What happens if another Ohio State offensive lineman goes down and he's out for the year? What happens if, Cody Simon or Sonny Styles or Caleb Downs are one of their safeties, one of their leading and better tacklers? What if one of them has a horrific injury? God willing, I hope not, and they're out for the year. Well, you're screwed against Oregon. The game isn't over, of course, but your odds of winning begin to decrease exponentially. Meanwhile, Oregon is rested. They have an additional week to prepare. And as long as they're well coached and they're practicing and they're not slacking off, they're going to come out and have a better chance to play their A game than if they played a game, 7, 8, 9, or 10 days earlier. So I think the bye does carry a lot of advantages to it. It's part of the reason why I think it should be done away with, because it's a bigger advantage than a lot of people realize. Or at least if you have byes, maybe you shouldn't give them to Boise State or Arizona State. I don't have a massive problem with that. It's more of a little thing, more like maybe a pet peeve than a major non-negotiable for me. It's just something to keep in mind with this playoff structure. It is flawed. It is a very flawed playoff structure. Someone says Penn State impressed me. Georgia won't win the Natty. I'm guessing Oregon versus Georgia. People are talking about, Alabama being left out, or that, Penn State proved themselves. Clemson is a topic of conversation. A Cover 3 podcast, I think whether it was Bud Elliott or Chip Patterson or Tom Fornelli, a few of them talked about how they think Clemson is going to make a run, or they at least think that Texas is going to be upset. That's something that we can talk about later this week. And yeah, there's just so much to talk about, and it's so fun. And I'm excited for these games that are coming up. Of course, there are flaws. There are things that need to be fixed. I think college football is a pretty confused, chaotic sport that's full of anarchy, but I love it nonetheless. Speaking of something that I loved the Big Ten championship game last night. Oregon held on to beat Penn State 45-37. 45-37. Should have been 45-38, but we had some very, very questionable decisions that were made in this game, to say the least. The Oregon Ducks led in this game, or tied, for 60 minutes. On their first drive, they scored right out of the gate, methodically marched down the field, controlled Penn State's defense, confused Penn State's defense, and had their way. Oregon opened up this game not just with 1 out of 1 touchdowns on scoring drives, not just 2 out of 2, but 3 out of 3. On Oregon's first 3 drives, they scored touchdowns on their first 3 drives against a Penn State defense that profiled as a top 10, if not top 5 defense nationally. And Oregon just worked them. It was score after explosive play. And they marched down the field. And much of it was through the air. Something that I was right on in this game in my deep dive and in my preview and prediction video was about how Penn State had the ground advantage here. Not that Penn State was more physical per se, because Oregon is one of the most, if not the most physical team in the country. And I think they're probably the toughest team in the country, but Penn State is pretty close in that regard. However, that Penn State had the better run-blocking offensive line, and they had the better defensive line overall. And you saw that here, because Penn State, they had several TFLs against Oregon. They would have had more if they tackled better, which is a concern for this Penn State defense. But they also ran for nearly 300 yards on Oregon. And that was not even, counting what they could have gained on their final drive, or on 2nd and 1, when they have 2 timeouts, they just decide to lob it up in the air, and it's picked off. Oregon's secondary, I think, could be argued to be the MVP in this football game, where the Oregon Ducks, Dante Manning, had an interception, nearly returned it for 6, returned it to the 1-yard line, and then Jordan James punched it in. And then Nico Reed with the interception at the end of the game, cornerback, one of Oregon's better defensive backs and corners. They're the MVPs right there, because if Penn State doesn't throw those 2 picks, or maybe Oregon doesn't catch those 2 picks, Penn State could have easily won. Oregon was always in control of this game. However, there were multiple points for Penn State to take momentum. At one point, this game was 28-10. And then Penn State went on a 14-3 run to close out the half. And it was 31-24. To kick off the second half, Penn State marches right down the field. Drew Aller barely overthrows Tyler Warren. Would have been a touchdown to tie it up 31-31. And then a few plays later, like maybe 1 or 2, Penn State shanks a 40-yard field goal. And Ryan Barker's a pretty accurate kicker. It was one of his first misses in quite some time. That was a momentum killer. And then Oregon, they scored a touchdown, made it a double-digit lead again. Penn State later on scored very quickly, 97 yards, after Oregon punted the ball and pinned Penn State deep. And then they went for 2, which was a very mind-boggling decision, which we'll talk about. But it was just It was catch up for Penn State. And they did a good job with it. And I thought that Tom Allen made pretty good adjustments in the second half. But Penn State could never match Oregon's speed. And while Oregon could never match Penn State's push in the trenches on both sides of the football, overall, Oregon had better coaching. They made better decisions. They committed fewer penalties, made less turnovers. And also, Oregon's edge over Penn State through the air was greater than Penn State's edge over Oregon on the ground. And all of those factors help negate the fact that the Big Ten championship game, from the sound of it, was essentially a Penn State home game, much like how the SEC championship is essentially a Georgia home game if Georgia participates. It negated the travel. It negated the fact that Penn State really was establishing game control, I think, in the second quarter, early part of the third quarter, and Oregon comes out with a win. The impact statistic here, or statistics, plural, is that Penn State had 2 turnovers and 65 penalty yards. Oregon had zero turnovers, and really only one play that could have been a turnover. A.J. Harris read a screen pass and nearly picked it off, but the ball was thrown pretty low. It probably wouldn't have been a pick, even if A.J. Harris, did somehow a better acrobatic and athletic move than he made. And Oregon also only had 24 yards in penalties. The refs in this game were pretty bad, but both teams were holding. The Big Ten doesn't call holding. They let you get physical. And yeah, what can I say? If Penn State, look, James Franklin said in the post-game press conference, well, they got to review some calls. And yeah, there were some calls that were bad. Like Amari Evans catches the football. They rule it incomplete somehow. But if Penn State doesn't throw those 2 picks, they win based off of the pace of the game. Seriously, they were going to drive and score a touchdown if not for throwing a turnover on that final drive where they threw the pick to Nico Reed down the sidelines. Or if Aller doesn't throw the pick where, again, Penn State special teams being a weakness for the Nittany Lions, if he wasn't pinned inside the 5 where he threw that pick to Dante Manning, they may have went down and scored a 90-plus yard touchdown, or at least gotten in field goal range to kick another Ryan Barker field goal. And what I just said right there is 10 potential points, maybe 14. If Ryan Barker makes the 40-yarder, that's potentially 17 points left on the board in an 8-point loss. And if one of those things happens, Penn State probably doesn't go for 2 either. The Nittany Lions could have easily won this football game, but Oregon was the better team. They were more disciplined, and they were better coached. And therefore, Dan Lanning, he won. He was the coach who got to hoist the Big Ten championship trophy, not James Franklin, even though both of these teams had moments to win. Penn State had advantages over Oregon. Penn State's interior defensive line and offensive line were the superior units. They had the better rushing attack, the better rushing defense. Their explosiveness at times matched Oregon's. It was an entertaining game. It was the most entertaining game of championship week by a mile. Very good game by both Penn State and Oregon. Oregon just played closer to their ceiling and made better decisions, both personnel-wise in terms of players not being as emotional. Penn State started off the game very emotional like the Ohio State game, consequentially committed some penalties, and they also made better in-game coaching decisions on the sidelines. Let's talk about Penn State here and then move on to Oregon. First and foremost, we're back here again. It's another loss for James Franklin against a top 5 team. Some decisions that really bugged me were the 2-point conversion, the pass happiness at the beginning of the game and the end of the game, and some of those penalties. It's just, what are you doing? What are you doing? I don't get it. I don't get the logic of going for 2. Unless you believe that your team can't get a final stop or they can't win a big game without some type of massive, exceptional advantage that maybe somehow you gain by scoring 1 extra point compared to your typical extra point, and otherwise you don't believe they can win a big game. Or you have no situational awareness and you always go by the analytics. You always do what the analytics say, even if situational awareness is begging you to not listen to the analytics. See, if James Franklin was Dan Campbell, and he always was Dan Campbell, I wouldn't have a problem with him going for 2. But he only does this in big games. It's not like he goes for 2 against Wisconsin on the road just to have a chance to steal some momentum and maybe put some more pressure on Wisconsin. It's not like he goes for 2 against USC on the road to get a win after Penn State has been roaring back, which would be a dumb decision because if you're roaring back, you simply want to survive in advance because eventually you'll steal the momentum and win anyway, like they did against USC. It's not like he went for 2 after getting the pick 6 against Ohio State to steal as many points as possible and maybe to rub it into Ohio State a little bit and make him mad. No, he only does this, the 2-point conversion stuff, when he is behind. He did it last year against Michigan, and the minute he did that, I thought to myself, he doesn't believe his team can score another offensive touchdown. He thinks they can only drive down and get a field goal. And you could tell when Penn State went for 2 that the players' body language changed. They did not believe it was going to work. They went from being fired up, they went from executing at a very high level to get down in 2 minutes, 23 seconds, mostly with runs, with amazing blocking, with precise throws, with a good, zone read play by backup QB, Wildcat QB Bo Pribula, to running the Philly special, and it looked like the, most uninspired 2-point conversion play I may have seen all year or in several years. That decision was mind-boggling. Also, Penn State, and we'll talk about this in a bit, they ran for 297 yards and 2 touchdowns on 34 carries. And yet they passed for more attempts, 39 attempts, 226 yards, only averaged 5.8 yards per pass attempt. They had 3 passing touchdowns, and Aller really had a fairly good game, but they also threw 2 critical interceptions that decided the game as well. And early on in the game, they had, I think, only 2 or 3 rushing attempts, but 10 or 11 passing attempts. And I saw that and I'm like, maybe this is smart to establish the pass. But in hindsight, I don't think it was the right decision, especially since I and many others, and I imagine Penn State, identified in their film study that they probably had an advantage on the ground against these guys. And maybe if they just started out the game running the football more and not being as pass happy, they could have done a better job of controlling the game and perhaps came out with a victory. And the penalties, of course, were mind-boggling. The personal fouls, you cannot start the game like that. The face masks, be more disciplined, but that all falls on James Franklin. Some positives for Penn State are the fact that Andy Kotelnicki has fixed this Penn State offense. They put up 523 total yards, 37 points. They gained 28 first downs. They had 297 rushing yards for 8.7 yards per carry and 2 rushing touchdowns. Penn State was 20-0 with Nicholas Singleton when he had over, I think, 60 rushing yards. He had 105 and they lost. Just, if you told me that Penn State put up these numbers before the game started, I would have picked him to beat Oregon in a blowout. I would have fallen for that. But Oregon won because they scored 45 points. And their quarterback put up a Heisman caliber game. And Jordan James, being Jordan James, also came through even when his offensive line didn't do the best job of helping him and blocking out in front of him. Jordan James is such a good running back, has such good patience, acceleration, skills. It's the same thing with Katron Allen and Nicholas Singleton. And they do a good job not just on the ground, where they combined for over 200 yards and a touchdown, but also through the air. They combined for close to 70 yards on 7 receptions, and Nicholas Singleton had a receiving touchdown. The running backs and tight ends for Penn State are their main weapons, along with wide receiver Harrison Walls III. They do not have a deep enough wide receiver room to punish most secondary. So what does Kotelnicki do? Well, he uses Singleton, he uses Allen, and he uses Tyler Warren, who is an alien player, one of the best players in the sport, not just one of the best tight ends in the sport, to make plays. And they scored 37 points. That was the best job an offense has done against Oregon all season long, even better than Ohio State when they had Josh Simmons and Seth McLaughlin. And Ohio State has infinitely better receivers than Penn State does. That's how good of an offensive coordinator Andy Kotelnicki is. So he did his job. Tom Allen, not so much, but they made some second half adjustments. You knew that Oregon was at least going to score in the low 20s, maybe high teens, worst case scenario, but Oregon played their A-plus game, and at the end of the day, I think that there may be some personnel limitations on defense, and maybe Penn State will have to look elsewhere with Tom Allen or members of that staff, but Kotelnicki did his job. I mean, they should give him as large of a deal as he wants, especially since he's looking at that West Virginia coaching job. Awesome offensive performance by Penn State. And I think Penn State, the last point I want to make about them before we talk about Oregon, is I think they have the nation's best trench play. You know, they ran for 297 yards, 8.7 yards per carry, 2 touchdowns. On defense, they had a sack. They didn't get much pressure on Dylan Gabriel all day, but they had 6 TFLs, and I know they allowed 186 rushing yards, and the defense on that final drive sort of quit after the pick was thrown. And honestly, given the fact that some decisions were made that shouldn't have been made, I wasn't as angry at that, because I don't like it when teams quit as I was against the Ohio State game, against Ohio State, for example. But they held Oregon to 4.5 yards per carry and 2 touchdowns. This is the same offense that, keep in mind, ran for over 5 yards per carry on Ohio State. And Ohio State's rushing defense is top 5 in almost every category. Penn State matched up against a Johnny Cornelius, Josh Connerly Jr., Marcus Harper, Nishad Strother, Iapani Lololu, an epic tight end room, and a gamer in Jordan James. And there were times where Oregon was not even averaging 4 yards per carry. There was a time, I think, when they were teetering on averaging less than 3 yards per carry. I think Penn State is the best trench play in the nation. I think their biggest question is James Franklin and his game management. And you can maybe say Tom Allen and how he coordinates the defense, or potentially you could also make the argument that the injuries that Penn State has suffered in the secondary may also be affecting some things against an Oregon receiver room that is the best in the country when it comes to speed and might be the best overall. Let's talk about Oregon, though. The Oregon Ducks have an elite head coach. They have a man in Dan Lanning who I think is someone of high character, who I think is an excellent strategist, who knows how to put together an elite staff, who knows his own limitations and his team's limitations and does the best to negate them. This year, he has almost always been one step ahead of his opponents. He is a great coach. If not for Curt Cignetti, if not for Kenny Dillingham, if not for Deion Sanders, if not for some other coaches who did exceptionally better than they did last year with some tough circumstances, especially talent-wise when it comes to Dillingham and Cignetti, and with all 3 of them, including Sanders and Kalani Sitake, when it came to their team's records last year, Lanning would be up for the Coach of the Year award. I mean, it's been impressive. They come into the Big Ten, they go 12-0, they play a Penn State team who I think right now is better than Ohio State, who I think is better than Indiana, who, and I'll show you this tomorrow, I think is one of the better chances of winning the national championship, and who I think is a top 4 team. And they beat them. They were ahead for 60 minutes, ahead or tied. The game was, I'm not going to say never in doubt, because there were times where it felt like, oh, Penn State's going to come back, or I wouldn't be shocked if they came back here. It's not that the game was never in doubt. It was rather the fact that Oregon, it was a game of tug of war where the flag in the middle of the rope was always on the Oregon side. It was never completely, like obviously several yards into the Oregon side, but it was hanging around the middle, leaning toward Oregon. And at the end of the game, because you only have 60 minutes, well, Oregon finally just pulled all the way back, and they outpaced Penn State, they outlasted Penn State, and they made the better decisions. Their team was more emotionally in check. They did not make the same schematic mistakes. There were some coverage busts and times where Andy Kotelnicki was working Tosh Lupoy, but there were also times where Will Stein, and more times than the other scenario where I presented, more times where Will Stein was outworking Tom Allen. And there were other times where Tosh Lupoy did a good job against Andy Kotelnicki, and I can't count as many times that Tom Allen did a good job against Will Stein. Like, Oregon put together the better game plan here, and that is ultimately why they won. They were one step ahead. You look at the Ducks right now, and I think that we're seeing college football's next dynasty, potentially. They're recruiting at a high level. They have a top 4 recruiting class, and they're developing at an elite level. Something I said is that a concern for this Oregon team is I don't know if they have any alien players. And after yesterday's game, I may still lean that way. I think Jordan James is really good. I mean, maybe he's an alien. Tez Johnson's speed, his speed is absolutely incredible. But I don't know if he's an alien or not. Abdul Carter is the nation's number 1 defensive end. Number 1. And the tackles and the plays that he were making, he was pretty limited in pass rush yesterday. But, I mean, he was going sideline to sideline, tackling Oregon players and preventing big plays. Just incredible, impressive player. And you look at Tyler Warren, who was open much of the time. If Aller was more like Dylan Gabriel and threw accurate balls, Warren probably would have had a receiving touchdown and maybe around 150 receiving yards, if not more. And he's a good blocker. And, I mean, just see what he did earlier this year against USC, where he carried them back in the game. I don't know if Oregon has players like those too. But what I can tell you is that Tez Johnson and Dylan Gabriel, and some of this is from their stops at other schools, but nonetheless, they're having their best seasons of their career. They were group of 5 players who right now are Oregon legends for what they did this year. And I know that Josh Connerly Jr. and a Johnny Cornelius could be alien players because Oregon right now leads the team in a quarterback sack percentage. They lead the Power 4, not FBS, but the Power 4 in quarterback protection, in pass protection. It's incredible what this staff has done and what this team has done. And what more do you want if you're Oregon? You want to win it all. But that's it. And if you don't win it all, you won the Big Ten in year 1, you got the first round bye, you did everything you had to in the regular season and in championship week. Oregon is the king of the Big Ten. They're also the first team to beat Michigan State, Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State in the same season. Doesn't matter that Michigan and Michigan State are having down years. This is Penn State's best team since 2017, in my mind. And this is an Ohio State team who was touted by everyone to be a national title contender, and by most of the college football channels I follow on YouTube to be the national champions. Like Josh Pate picked them to win it all. Joel Klatt picked them to win it all. And you beat those teams. You beat Ohio State, that could have been a double-digit win. You beat Penn State, could have been a double-digit point win. And you also could have lost to both of those teams. But you didn't. You beat both of them. And you crushed Michigan in their own house. And that game against Michigan State was never close in Outson. You beat all 4 of those teams, all great programs, many of them blue bloods. You beat them all in the same season. And now, in my mind, you're the national title favorites. You're developing an elite level. You're coaching at an elite level. For the future, you're recruiting at an elite level. You'll have alien players. If you disagree with me that Oregon doesn't have alien players like Jeremiah Smith at Ohio State, or Caleb Downs at OSU, or Abdul Carter or Tyler Warren at Penn State, or like Brock Bowers at Georgia from last year, if you disagree with that sentiment, that's okay, because you'll get alien players in the future. You will. And does it really matter? Because maybe you don't have a Tyler Warren or Abdul Carter, but you don't have the same holes in your roster that everyone else does. And we'll talk about that. You don't have many, if any, obvious weaknesses. And I think that all those things combined, You have a lot of elite players. You have several NFL players. You don't have any obvious roster holes. Your coach is top 5. Your staff might be number 1. Your talent pool is growing. And I think you're the nation's toughest team because Penn State never quit until the end. Because you never quit, Oregon. When Penn State had the momentum, you found a way. You found a way to retain the lead. And even if you didn't, you would have been tied because of what you built up earlier in the game. For 60 minutes, again, you led or tied, and you responded to momentum changes. And you only allowed 1 sack. That player I have been talking about for weeks now, who college football has been talking about for weeks, who actually myself and everyone else in college football has been really talking about for months, in Abdul Carter, and also his counterpart, Denai Dennis Sutton, and other defensive linemen like Devon J. Thomas, Zane Durant, you held them to 1 sack. 1. They had 6 TFLs. They won the ground game. They statistically did what a Big Ten team needs to do to win a football game. The laws of the Big Ten say that Penn State should have won the game by the stat line. They outgained their opponent in yards, yeah, but more importantly, they had that many more rushing yards. And yet, Oregon won the TOP battle. They were ahead or tied for the entire game. And it's not like Penn State completely shut down the rushing attack. They had the way better rushing attack, but Oregon finished with over 4 yards per carry, and they only allowed 1 sack. They protected Gabriel the whole game, and he had a very clean pocket. So I think that Oregon right now is the number 1 team in the country, and I don't just think that's resume-wise. I think power ratings-wise, Oregon should be number 1. I picked Penn State to beat Oregon. I was wrong on that front. I was right in a lot of the ways that the game played out in terms of the matchups, but Oregon saw those matchups. They were losing some of those matchups, and they won anyway. And that's what the national title contenders, that's what the national champions at the end of the year do, is they just win. And they outcoach their opponents, and they're tough as nails. And that's Oregon. And that's the highest respect and highest honor that I can pay any team. So, that's that. Oregon is that good. They are that team. And we'll talk about later in this video how I think they'll win it all. They'll win it all. The Oregon Ducks, I believe, will win it all. So, actually, let's get to that. Let's get to some of this. Let's talk about why Oregon can win a national title. It's a nice segue. A little bit of a slower segue. I like to cool down after talking about an intense game like that, because it was intense. It was 45-37. It was back and forth. It was an offensive shootout. Big play after big play. Drew Aller converted a 4th and long, 2 third and longs. Gabriel converted several 3rd and longs. It was an awesome, awesome state of affairs. But here's why Oregon can win it all. The Oregon Ducks are 13-0. They're 9-0 in Big Ten Conference play. They are the Big Ten champions, and I want to talk about why they can win the national championship. The Oregon Ducks can win the national championship because they are the nation's best team. They have one of the best rosters in college football, if not the best roster in college football. And even with many people talking about how their seeding positions them in a non-advantageous way, I think that the Ducks have faced many challenges this season, and they have overcame them all. And right now, I would say power ratings-wise or strength of record-wise, doesn't really matter. They're the best team in the nation, the Oregon Ducks are. The identity of this team, let's start there, because I think that when you're competing for a national championship, you need a concrete, solid identity, reinforced with steel bars, reinforced with steel. The teams that win it all have an identity that is constructed with the strength of a bunker, with a bunker that can withstand a nuclear blast. Think about Michigan last year, losing a player like Zach Zinner, or think about Ohio State in 2014, losing their starting QB in the preseason, and then their starting QB from the regular season at the end of the regular season, and winning it all with their third-string quarterback. Think about Alabama switching from Jalen Hurts to Tua Tagovailoa in the 2017 national championship game. The teams that win it all withstand nuclear blasts because their identities are that strong. Well, what Oregon's identity is they are physical. They are veteran-laden. They have an NFL roster full of future professional players. And I think a good saying that expresses who Oregon is they just throw the kitchen sink at them. Whatever they have, whatever is in their tool belt, they will use. They will leave nothing to waste to win the game that is in front of them. And they take things one step at a time. They are well coached. They are disciplined. They tackle well. They pursue well. They are athletic. They are explosive. They are strong. Oregon's the best team in the country. What else can I say? And a huge part of it is because their identity and their culture is that strong. They made the right moves in the preseason. They're making the right moves now. They make good decisions both on the field and off the field. They scheme well. Their players are some of the best in the country. They are deep, and they don't have very many, if any, weaknesses. You see that NA right there under the title, Oregon's weaknesses? That's not applicable. Potentially, the rushing defense could be a problem. They're 51st right now in opponent yards per carry. That's mainly because Penn State ran for close to 300 yards and almost 9 yards per carry, though. And remember, they played Ashton Jeanty. They played Ohio State when Josh Simmons was healthy for about a quarter or two, and his backup still did well in that game. So they faced, Travion Henderson and Quinjon Judkins with a better supporting cast than what they've had for much of the year. They played Wisconsin. They played Michigan on the road. They played Jonah Coleman of Washington and completely limited him. They played Oregon State, who has a good rushing offense. They faced a lot of good rushing offenses. So I don't know if their rushing offense is exactly a weakness. I think it's a weak link of the team. Their rushing defense is a weak link. Their rushing offense does also have some inconsistencies to them, but I wouldn't say that's a weakness. But the rushing defense is just a potential weakness because there are other moments where I've seen it just step up and perform at a high level. Another possible weakness is limited upside. This is something that I've talked about with Oregon before. I don't know if they have a player who can carry them in a game single-handedly. Penn State has Tyler Warren. Ohio State has Jeremiah Smith. They have Caleb Downs on defense. Penn State has Abdul Carter on defense. You look at, for example, Brock Bowers from Georgia last year. Michigan has Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant on the interior of that D-line that really help out a linebacker group and a DB group that have struggled all season long. Nebraska was hoping that Dylan Raiola would be an alien this year. Iowa's Cooper DeJean last year was an alien with what he was doing. I think Oregon may have those players, but they also may not. That may not matter, though, because Oregon is such a good team at so many things that I don't know if they will ever need a player to win a game for them single-handedly. Like, they won't need Dylan Gabriel to lead the team in rushing yards and at the same time to have a perfect game through the air in order to have just a chance at winning a football game. They won't need Jordan James to turn into Ashton Jeanty to have a chance at winning a game. So maybe my opinion that Oregon doesn't have the same type of alien players that Penn State or Ohio State does at certain positions, maybe that's skewed by the fact that Oregon has never been in a position where they are so desperate to the point where they are trying to rely on one player to win a game for them. Maybe I'm incorrect there, but I think it's more likely to be a bit of both rather than just one or the other. But those are just possible weaknesses. Those are not definite weaknesses. I don't think Oregon has any obvious weak points. They don't have any loopholes that the other team can use to totally negate Oregon's strengths. You have to just beat Oregon straight up. You can't really cheese your way into beating them. And by cheesing your way into winning, I don't mean that you don't deserve the win, but you're abusing a weakness of theirs and totally going around them. You can't go around Oregon. You have to go through Oregon. You have to puncture them. You can't just run around them. The strengths, on the other hand, for Oregon are, I would say, everything. Like coaching, quarterback play, running back play, wide receiver play, tight end play, offensive line play, D-line play, linebacker play, secondary play. And by strengths, of course, I mean nationally. Obviously, some of these rooms are weaker than other rooms, but in comparison to all of the FBS players and position groups, all of Oregon's groups are strong. They're deep, they have high upside, they have NFL players, they're athletic, and they're well coached. And there's everything to like about that. Oregon's a very easy team to root for because they're that good, and they're not arrogant, and they're not scummy. And they just work. They're hardworking. And they, like I said earlier in this video, they throw the kitchen sink at their opponents. And often what they do in those circumstances, often how they body blow people, is in their elite passing offense and also pass protection, where they really have a symbiotic relationship there. The tackles do well, the offensive line does well, and then Gabriel has time to throw or time to scramble, and that results in his high completion percentage. I mean, Gabriel right now, the Oregon Ducks QB, he had a 95.4 QBR, 4 touchdowns, averaged nearly 9 yards per attempt against Penn State. He has an 86.5 QBR, which is second nationally, 28 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. He has passed for 3,558 yards on the year, and he's completing 73.2% of his passes with a 166.6 passer rating, 7 rushing touchdowns, 192 rushing yards. He's only been sacked 13 times this year. And that's Dylan Gabriel, Tez Johnson, Evan Stewart, Kenyon Sadiq, Terrence Ferguson, Trayshawn Holden, even occasionally Noah Whittington or Jordan James at running back out of the backfield, and a Johnny Cornelius, Josh Connerly Jr., and that offensive line all working together. And then I would also say that the defensive line, the linebacker room, and DB are key strong points too. I think really that Oregon's entire roster is full of strong points nationally. You don't just have areas where you are stronger, where you're like top 25 compared to the field. Oregon's entire roster, I think, is top 5 compared to the field. Position groups are top 15 or top 10. They're not just good players, they're great, near elite players. And I think that has built this efficiency monster that Oregon is playing with here right now, where, you go 13-0. You're the only undefeated team. You're the obvious number 1 seed. And even though you have a very hard path to the national title, because you'll play winner of Tennessee, Ohio State, and then the winner of Texas Clemson, and then whoever wins that, the winner of whoever again wins Texas Clemson against Arizona State, and then you got to play whoever's in the other side of the bracket, you're still one of the favorites to win it all. In fact, depending on where the odds are, you may be the favorite to win it all, though I don't have the sports books in front of me, because Oregon is an elite team. And when you look at non-negotiables, areas where you could see alien players, or where the rooms are that deep and that strong to where if you're an opponent, you have to deal with this. This is why Oregon beat Penn State, because Penn State couldn't deal with the non-negotiable of Oregon's speed at wide receiver. They couldn't counteract that. They tried to go around it. They tried at times to also just go through it, to be the immovable object against the unstoppable force. But Oregon's wide receiver room showed against Penn State, they are the unstoppable force, and Penn State's secondary is very much a movable object. Jordan James this year, he's a non-negotiable, could be an alien player. 1,455 all-purpose yards, 15 touchdowns. Tez Johnson at wide receiver, 866 receiving yards, 10 touchdowns. And Oregon also leads the Power 4 in sack percentage thanks to Johnny Cornelius and Josh Connerly Jr. at offensive tackle. Oregon can win the national championship because they have so much non-negotiables and so many X-factor players on offense, combined with an elite offensive coordinator and a defense that can get clutch stops, and I think is still a top 15 unit, could even be top 10 nationally. Remember, This is a down year in football. So Penn State and Oregon may have top 10 or even potentially, although I doubt this, top 5 defenses, but the sport is so unbalanced and there's no GOAT caliber side of the football or team to where Oregon's defense can have a really bad day or Penn State's defense can have a very bad day, and that happens because of the circumstances of this season, whether it's because of the portal, NIL, the fact that there were a lot of talented players, alien players, elite QBs, for example, that left for the NFL, that departed for the NFL after the 2023 season. Teams are going to have a hard time dealing with these running backs, receivers, with the offensive tackles. Oregon often struggled on the inside run against Penn State, but Jordan James had such perimeter speed and patience, and Oregon's offensive tackles were so good that when he ran to the outside, he very often picked up at minimum 5 yards, if not 10, 15, sometimes even more than that. Teams will have a hard time stopping the explosiveness of this team, and an even harder time getting pressure on Dillon Gabriel, which again, circle back, means the receivers have more time to run their routes. Gabriel has time to comfortably read the defense, to go through his progressions. And against Penn State, who has talent on defense, there was someone open all the time. And it was basically the same thing against Ohio State. And Ohio State, I think, is the nation's best defense. So Texas, you're not safe. You're not safe from Oregon's offense. And Oregon's defense is good enough to hold your struggling offense in check. If Oregon matches up with Penn State again, it's potentially the same story as yesterday, where it's a high-scoring game. Penn State can win, but Oregon is just that much better in some matchups to where they'll beat you. As for Georgia, good luck scoring on this defense consistently with the backup QB if Beck's injury is that serious, and it looks like it. And Georgia's passing defense all season long has been questionable. How is Oregon going to do against that passing defense? Probably pretty good. So I think you get the picture that these non-negotiables for Oregon and how they're playing football helps them in their national title quest, in their quest for being the nation's number one team. And at this point, if you're going to win the national title, you'll be the first team in college football playoff history and college football history to go 16-0. What a job by Dan Lanning so far, and I expect that there are bigger and better things to come for the Oregon Ducks. Not just in the future, like far future, but in the immediate near future, as in this season. Some X-Factor players to talk about on offense, and then we'll move on to the defense here. Quarterback Dillon Gabriel, running back Jordan James, wide receivers Tez Johnson and Evan Stewart, tight end Terrence Ferguson, and tackles Josh Connerly Jr. and Ajani Cornelius. I thought that Nishad Strother had some good plays yesterday. Kenyon Sadiq with that amazing hurdle for a touchdown was also an impressive player. And I think that Noah Whittington when healthy, can provide a good boost and can be a good complement to Jordan James and a good substitution for him as well when you have to rest him. And obviously, Trayshawn Holden at wide receiver is a good player as well. And Oregon just is so deep on the offensive side of the ball. They're so good, accurate, precise, quick striking, have excellent acceleration. This is one of college football's best offenses. And dare I say, because they have played better defenses than Miami, I think at peak capacity, this is college football's best offense. Looking at the defense here, I think that Derek Harmon, even though he had a pretty quiet day yesterday, is still an X-Factor player. I just think that Penn State is that good on the offensive line. Mateo Uyunglele and Jordan Birch at defensive end, also X-Factor players, not aliens. I don't think they're as good as Abdul Carter, but they're good. They're players that most teams in the college football playoff are going to have issues with. Penn State has one of the better offensive lines in the nation. Potentially, after yesterday, they could have the nation's best offensive line. So, no shame in the performance on the defensive line from Oregon yesterday. It's got to improve. Same with what happened at linebacker, but they're X-Factor players. Same thing with Bryce Betcher, who's had a phenomenal season. Nico Reed at corner and cornerback Jabbar Muhammad, I think, are X-Factor players as well. This is a talented defense. It's a defense that's well coached. They are deep, disciplined. They have explosiveness, and they're very physical. Same thing as the offense. They're not as good as the offense, but they're still a great unit nationally. So that's Oregon and why the Oregon Ducks can win the national championship. Let's move on now and talk about why Penn State can win a national championship. Penn State lost to Oregon by a score of 37-45, and there were some questionable decisions that head coach James Franklin made, and Penn State was just, oh so close, but also far away from Oregon at the same time, constantly trailing. I believe Oregon is the best team in the country, and yet at the same time, Penn State was in the boxing ring with Oregon, and they had chances to overthrow the Ducks and look like the nation's best team as well. So I want to talk about why Penn State can win the national championship. I do think they're one of America's best teams. And in addition, we won't talk about this too much, but their path in the college football playoff is pretty easy. You host SMU. If you beat SMU at home, you meet up with Boise State in a night game in a neutral site. And then whether it's Georgia, Indiana, or Notre Dame, who you could hypothetically face in the semifinal, those teams have severe limitations. Roster-wise, they are inferior to you. Coaching staff-wise, that's a totally different story with some of the questionable decisions that we know Franklin to make in big games that we've seen him make this year against Ohio State and also against Oregon. But Penn State right now has a great roster, and they can win the national championship. This team's identity is physicality. They want to be physical. They are physical. They also want to be tactical, and in many ways they are tactical. Andy Kotelnicki is the best offensive coordinator in the country, and Tom Allen, I think, is a good defensive coordinator. I just think that he got caught up against the nation's number one offense, or at least one of the best offenses in the country, that honestly has a matchup advantage against his secondary. Of course, could have done a better job, should have done a better job, but I think that the coordinators and assistant coaches for Penn State really helped them in their quest to win it all. They are experienced, especially along the lines of scrimmage where they have a plethora of seniors, both starting and also in the two deep. They make elite adjustments, often winning the second half or pushing in the second half against their opponents, even in the big games. Against Ohio State, they figured out Ohio State's offense, held it to only field goals in the second half. If they just scored in the end zone on that final drive that they had, they probably would have outscored Ohio State in the second half. And against Oregon, they came out with juice and momentum after halftime, and I think in many ways they won the second half against Oregon. It's just Oregon sort of game-controlled Penn State and even owned them at times in the first, and they held on like the good teams do. And Penn State also has NFL-caliber depth. They have an NFL roster. It's one of the best rosters in all of college football. I think, as we'll talk about in this video, it's actually the best roster in all of college football when it comes to your potential to game control your opponents and dictate the pace of the game. There are, of course, things that are problematic, though, for Penn State. I think that the Nittany Lions right now have some limitations at quarterback. I think that their wide receiver room isn't deep. The special teams have been disastrous all season long. And you could add to the list of Penn State's weaknesses, you could add coaching. Not from their coordinators, especially not from their assistant coaches, who I think make up one of the best assistant coaching pools in the country, from their head coach, from the CEO, who ultimately makes the biggest decisions and who is often called upon in the biggest of games because he holds them back. I sent out on Twitter an opinion of mine, and maybe because if Penn State wins the playoff, this opinion might be made invalid, at least for this year. In fact, it would be invalid this year because the tweet was about this season. The opinion was that if Dan Lanning had Penn State's roster and he coached against Dan Lanning with Oregon's roster, Penn State wins yesterday. In fact, they win it all. That if Jim Harbaugh teleported to Happy Valley and coached Penn State this year with the staff, with the roster, only thing that's different is James Franklin out, Jim Harbaugh in. They win the national title. Same thing if it's Kirby Smart, for example, or Nick Saban, or I even said Jonathan Smith from Michigan State. I mean, he likes to run power football, power spread. Penn State's built to do that. I think that Ryan Day would have a much easier time with some of his own team's identity crisis about being physical with this Penn State roster than with his current Ohio State roster. And I think he would do great things with this team and win big games. They have weaknesses, the Nittany Lions do, and teams are going to take advantage of that. They're going to take advantage of the coaching mistakes. They are going to take advantage the best they can of Penn State's limitations at wide receiver. They are going to take advantage of the special teams errors, try to pin Penn State deep, and be able to try and block Penn State's punts or return punts against Penn State. Riley Thompson's been a bit shaky this year. And also try and confuse Drew Aller, who does get confused, and put him under the bright lights, get pressure on him, because his footwork under pressure is not secure, like we saw against the Oregon Ducks. The Nittany Lions are not without weaknesses here. However, their strengths are immaculate. They're incredible. Running back room is one of the best in the nation. The tight end room is the best in the nation, full stop. Their offensive line might be the nation's best. It's the same thing with their defensive line. No one has the O-line, D-line combination that the Nittany Lions do this year. No one. Maybe Ohio State, when their starting offensive line was completely healthy, but even then I've been more impressed with Penn State's defensive line this year than Ohio State's. And what they did to Oregon, what they did to many teams this year, Maryland, where Maryland had 8 TFLs and yet Penn State ran for over 200 yards. They had one of their inferior games on the O-line and were without Anthony Donko for the first time for a full game, and they still bullied Maryland on the ground, which, again, it's just Maryland, but it's something to keep in mind. They ran the ball well against Wisconsin as the game went on. They killed Illinois on the ground. And, of course, that game against Oregon, where they had nearly 300 yards, that was super impressive. And you look on defense, D-line, linebacker, secondary, I think they're strong at many points on their roster. And the second half adjustments really help Penn State as well. They are the nation's best second half team. And I don't think anyone would debate that after the Big Ten championship game. The problem is they do start slow in almost every way, both in discipline, in execution, in play calling, and that puts them behind the 8 ball at times. There have been other times where they put themselves behind the 8 ball even as the game has gone on, like against Ohio State in the second quarter, or against Oregon where they were down by 18 points in the second quarter. This is an elite team, though, relative to this year. Of course, I think this is a down year in football. I don't think this Penn State team is better than, let's say, last year's Ohio State team or last year's Michigan team. It's probably, in a lot of ways, similar to last year's Georgia team, for example. And then again, because of coaching, I would not pick them against last year's Georgia or even last year's Oregon. And there are many other teams in 2022, 2021, Alabama for sure in 2020, several teams in 19. We could go on and on and on that I would pick to beat every team in this year, including Penn State. But all that matters is this year. Penn State doesn't have to play anyone from prior years, and no one from prior years has to play Penn State. That's not how this works. That's hypothetical. That's for fun. In the here and now, Penn State has one of the best rosters in the country. They are the nation's best team, and I think in terms of game control, in terms of playing Big Ten football, and in terms of the saying that defense wins championships, and trench play and running the ball, being physical wins championships, Penn State may have the nation's best roster in that regard. Their key strong points are running back with Singleton and Allen, tight end with Tyler Warren and Khalil Dinkins, the offensive line, Olivega Ione, you got Drew Shelton, you have Nolan Rucci, you have J.B. Nelson, you also have Nick Dawkins, who, my goodness, Nick Dawkins showed out yesterday, had an awesome game, very physical player, veteran, a leader of men. Penn State's offensive line and their D-line is incredible. They have a game-controlling offense that when their defense plays well, they can dictate the pace of the game. And a defense that, relative to this season, I'm going to say is still elite, even after yesterday. Think about it this way. Ohio State's defense is better than Penn State's. It's the best defense in the country, and I think it's clearly better than Penn State's. Oregon could have scored 39 points if they make that fourth down conversion, and at that point, it's a nickel and dime difference between what they did to Penn State's defense. I just think Oregon's offense, the way it's schemed, the fact they have several X-factor players, if their offense has any aliens at all, and the more I think about it, they're all on offense, and they're all really in the passing offense, makes it so hard to defend. So hard to defend. Oregon plays Big Ten football, but they also brought their Pac-12 element on offense, and that includes a speed and acceleration that I don't think many Big Ten defenses are used to. It's why the SEC teams at times, or some of the Southern schools, would blitz Big Ten teams at times when they matched up in the postseason, because Oregon has a speed to them that I don't think anyone else in the Big Ten does. Penn State showed some of that, by the way, on the defensive line with Abdul Carter. They showed it a lot on the offensive line and at running back as well. So this is a strong team. And when you look at the positions, the non-negotiables, where Penn State is going to cause issues from these position groups to other teams, I look at Tyler Warren at tight end, 1,202 all-purpose yards, 11 touchdowns. I look at the offensive line, who's helping the rushing offense to average 5.3 yards per carry, which is 15th nationally, and a defensive line that's holding their opponents to 3.3 yards per carry nationally. And they played Oregon. They've played Darius Taylor in Minnesota. They've played USC and Woody Marks, who are top 15 in yards per carry. They faced off against Bowling Green, who has a good rushing offense and a good offense overall. West Virginia, who has a great rushing offense at times. They played Ohio State, and Ohio State was injured on the O-line, but they put together a nice game plan with their rushing game, where Chip Kelly called a lot of speed options and took advantage of some things. And Penn State's defense, I still think, especially in the trenches, is elite here, guys. I mean, Abdul Carter, Denai Dennis Sutton, Zane Durant, and then on the O-line, Nick Dawkins, J.B. Nelson, Olavega Ione, especially on the interior of that O-line, and then Tyler Warren at tight end. These are players that will cause issues for opposing offenses and defenses. These are position groups where, let's say, for Georgia has had some issues at times defending the pass and even defending the run. They're going to have to go through this O-line. They're not going to be able to scheme around the O-line or scheme around Tyler Warren. They're just going to have to stop him, and that's going to be hard. Georgia and Texas this year have had problems running the ball with their O-line. They're going to have to go through Penn State's D-line. They can't just go around it. Penn State's too complete of a team, and they're too good at those positions. They're just going to have to stop them, like Oregon did. Oregon shut down Penn State's pass rush, but Oregon is the best offensive tackle duo in college football. With the non-negotiables for any team, not all teams have them. Few do, but Penn State's one who has multiple. You just have to face them. You can't run away from them. You have to stand your ground. You have to face them. You have to be aggressive. You have to declare war. You cannot appease them. You can't be diplomatic about it. You have to go to war. And Penn State's non-negotiables are their trench play and also their tight end, Tyler Warren, who is a Swiss Army knife and exceptional at catching the football. He is an X-factor player on offense. Same with the running backs, Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen, center Nick Dawkins, and guard Olavega Ione. Those are the X-factor players for Penn State's offense. Those are the players that move Andy Kotelnicki's unit, that execute his plays the best, that help Penn State score more touchdowns and be more explosive than they were last year. And Warren is not just an X-factor player through the air. He's an elite blocker. And he can make moves on the ground, too, when they put him at Wildcat quarterback. Katron Allen and Nicholas Singleton aren't just threats on the ground as running backs, but through the air as receivers, particularly Nicholas Singleton. And Nick Dawkins and his offensive line, he's the center, the leader of that group, they aren't just physical. and they don't just put their heads down and do well at downfield blocking and all those things in the rushing game. They are good at pass protection. Ohio State only got 2 sacks on them, even when they blitzed. It was 2 in a row where they changed up their coverage scheme, and it was more so a coverage sack than a pressure sack in both of those instances. Oregon only got 1 sack on Penn State, and it was a sack on Bo Pribula, the backup QB, on kind of a weird play, not Drew Aller. This offense is one of the nation's best. It's a top 5 offense by ESPN's efficiency, and it may even be higher than the 5th best offense or even 4th best offense nationally. It's peaking right now. The defense has some work to do, but I still think the defense is full of X-factor players too. I think that when you look at, Zane Durant, Abdul Carter, Denai Dennis Sutton along the defensive line, you got linebacker Kobe King, corner A.J. Harris, you got Jalen Reed at safety. Those are X-factor players, in my mind, for Penn State. I think that's very clear. I think that the defense for Penn State, they have some issues, but they're good. They're great. I would even say elite. And that's all I'm going to say for the defense. They have some things to work through. I think they'll get some of them right. Ultimately, if Penn State wants to win it all, it's going to come down more sort of James Franklin than players on defense or players on offense. They have an elite defense with players who will make you pay, who will earn TFLs, who will earn sacks, earn turnovers, potentially win the game for the offense. So that's why Penn State can win it all. I am going to take a break really, really quick just to get some water, but I'll be back up in a minute 30 seconds, maybe 2 or 3 minutes at the most. So make sure to subscribe. Make sure to like the video, and I will be back very quickly. Thank you for the consistent viewership, for the support, and I will literally see you in like 2-3 minutes. All right, everyone. Well, we're back. We are indeed back. I just discovered that I accidentally forgot to record. I forgot to record many of these segments, so I'll have to I think that means I'll have to wait for many of these to be uploaded until tomorrow, but we still have some more things to go over. So, yeah, those segments, if you haven't caught everything, or you're not going to stay for the whole show because it's going to be, pretty long as things are, you'll be able to see some of the segments that we have done tonight. All of them will be uploaded by tomorrow easily. And then again, remember everyone, we are going live tomorrow to talk about, an early preview of these games. We'll maybe talk about some things about the other Big Ten schools that aren't a part of the national title conversation. And I'll also talk about, very briefly, my solution to, the current playoff structure, because it's flawed and it, to a certain degree, sucks. Okay, let me read some comments before I get into things here, because I haven't seen the comments in a while, but I do like to read them. Okay, in championship games, a lot of times, who makes less mistakes instead of who makes the greatest plays wins. The little things matter. Yes. Bingo. And that explains Oregon perfectly. Oregon is not always the flashiest team. Although yesterday they were pretty flashy. But the little things matter so much. They really do. And Oregon executed at a high level. What more can I say? Notre Dame shouldn't even be allowed in the playoffs. Their best win is USC, which is insanity. I don't think they shouldn't be allowed in the playoffs because analytics say they're clearly a good team. They beat USC, who's good. They beat A&M in a similar fashion that Texas did. And Texas is a playoff team. Like, it's obvious Notre Dame is one of the top 11, top 10 teams in the country, power ratings-wise. And strength of record-wise, they're pretty good, too. But I do think that because of that loss to NIU and how bad it was, and also how weak the strength of schedule was, like Florida State was far worse than we thought, for example, I do think, although the Georgia Tech one was pretty good, I will admit, I do think that they should have probably been flipped with Ohio State and maybe even Tennessee. Like, part of me thinks that part of me thinks that, like, Indiana should have gotten a home playoff game over Notre Dame, for example, or even Tennessee, but more so, I think, Indiana. But that's a conversation for another day, because Indiana and Notre Dame both have weak strength of schedules, but Indiana's loss to Ohio State on the road, yes, it was a dominant loss, but Ohio State is top 5 analytically. NIU is 7-5, and Notre Dame lost to them at home, so yeah, I do kind of think it's ridiculous that Indiana's traveling to Notre Dame instead of it being the other way around, maybe, but okay, that's a conversation for tomorrow. Nebraska 2024 Pinstripe Bowl champs, that's a game I'll be talking about for sure. Oregon fan here. The Ducks have all the tools and have been able to ride the offense or defense or special teams to win games. Penn State was impressive too last night. Hope they meet again. There is a very good chance that Penn State rematches with Oregon in the national championship game. That is a very, I think, likely outcome. A very likely outcome. SMU looked great in the second half against Clemson. Yes, they did. Yeah, Birch was slow off the ball. His explosiveness is what made him hard to block. I guess we'll see in 3 weeks. Yeah, I mean, you were in my comments section talking about how is Birch not an X Factor player. I was open to being wrong. I think that game sort of proved that I wasn't, but I mean, again, hey, your Ducks won here. I mean, you were right on that. I was wrong in thinking that Penn State was going to win. I don't think my prediction overall was terrible. Penn State could have easily won. I think everyone with a brain saw that was a possibility, but they didn't, and that's what matters here. Oregon's the best team in the country. Oregon has, quote-unquote, struggled in red zone touchdowns against teams with great DBs. If I had to nitpick, but it's not really a weakness, Penn State has great DBs. The problem is they don't have enough elite DBs to cover all of Oregon's elite weapons and their quarterback. It's just, like you said, you have to nitpick. You have to nitpick to find Oregon's weaknesses. It's crazy how good this team is. But let's move on here. I want to do something radical. Radical here. Radical. Pardon me, before I get to this, my cat moved my camera, so let me just get up and fix that quickly. All right, apologies there. My own studio, for context, is my bedroom. So, yeah, when my cat decides he wants to roam and then rub his head on something and it happens to be my camera, yeah, you can see the picture. And now he's just minding his own business, acting like he didn't do anything, which is okay. He is the family pet. But I'm going to do something radical here. What if I told you that Indiana may actually have a shot to win the national championship? What if I told you that Indiana can do the unthinkable? A program that does not have half of its roster full of blue chip players. A program who last year finished the season 3-9 with one Big Ten win. They already have done many things that are unthinkable. Going 11-1 in conference, 8-1, or 8-1 conference, 11-1 overall. And they stand right now on the brink of a playoff win, playing Notre Dame, who is also 11-1, not invincible, in South Bend, but again, home playoff game for Notre Dame. It's a single-digit spread in favor of Notre Dame. Indiana has a shot to win, clearly. That's why they're in the playoff. And from there, maybe they can go on a run. It would be challenging. It would be hard. It's not likely to happen, but it's possible. And I want to talk about why that's possible, why Indiana can go on a college football playoff run, why they can make some noise, and potentially why they can win the national championship, or at least make the national championship. So let's dive in here. As I have said time and time again, a good team, a national title contender, an elite team, their identity is as strong as a radiation-proof bunker, as a nuclear bunker, concrete, reinforced with steel, with titanium. And Indiana's identity, their roster is not the best in the country. It's not. It's not as good as Ohio State's, as Penn State's, as Oregon's, the other teams in their sphere in the Big Ten. It is not as good as Georgia's or Texas's. It is one of the worst rosters in the playoff field. Just honestly, it is middle of the road in this playoff field at best. Might be one of the worst. I'd actually lean toward middle of the field the more I think about it, but not the best. But their identity is one of the strongest because they are the most fundamentally sound team in football. When I watch Indiana play, they remind me the most of a Nick Saban Alabama team. Now again, they're not the nation's best team in my mind. But what I mean by that is they're fundamentally sound. They tackle well. They always punch above their weight class. They destroy anyone who is similar to them or worse than them in talent. They do the little things well. They're physical. They're experienced, and they make great coaching decisions. And when they don't do any of those things, they learn from their mistakes. They are one of those teams who, as the year has progressed, has gotten better. They started off the year only beating FIU 31-7, and they didn't play a very good game. And they had a very easy out-of-conference schedule. And they allowed 24 points to Northwestern, for example, as a horrible offense. But then out of their first bye, they beat Nebraska 56-7. They handle Washington, with a backup QB. They crushed Michigan State on the road. They could have beaten Michigan to a pulp, but they took their foot off the gas in the second half. And they played one of the worst games that I've ever seen them play this year. In fact, their worst game by a mile in terms of quality, made uncharacteristic special teams mistakes, couldn't protect the QB, and they still were competing with Ohio State for a half. And it could have been a much more competitive game if they made less mistakes and Ohio State played the same game they did. This is a great team. Indiana can make some noise in the college football playoff. They can cause some chaos. They can be an agent of chaos in the postseason, as they have been in the regular season. Their weakness is clearly team talent and lack of elite depth. I don't think from an individual roster or player standpoint, like looking at things under a microscope, they have any weaknesses. They're similar to Oregon from the microscopic view, from looking at things position by position. Like they have one of the nation's best QBs in terms of efficiency. Their running back room is stacked. Their O-line is physical and protects rather well. They have a deep stable of receivers, good tight ends. Their run defense might be the nation's best. It's the best in the Big Ten right now. You look at their linebacker play, that helps there too. And even though their DBs are short and small, they have one of the better coverage units in the nation. And their special teams outside of that Ohio State game has been pretty good as well. It's the broad picture that is the problem for Indiana, where if they suffer an injury at any of those positions, the offensive line is a perfect example of this, where one of their starters went down, things are shakier. They don't have the same type of ability to just substitute in a similar caliber player if they suffer an injury like Ohio State does, unless it's the offensive line, that Penn State does, unless it's the wide receiver room, that Oregon does, unless it's, oh wait, they're deep at every position. Indiana is shallower than a lot of the higher level college football playoff teams, participants, in almost every position. Except for maybe quarterback, where I think Taven Jackson would be pretty good as the starter. Limited compared to Rourke, but pretty good nonetheless. I think he filled in pretty well in the second half against Nebraska, and more importantly, against Washington. That is Indiana's weakness, is their lack of elite depth, and also their lack of team talent. But I think they've showed at multiple positions that they are talented, and I'm someone who thinks recruiting is important from a standpoint of recruiting rankings, the blue chip ratio from Bud Elliott, and these other rules surrounding that. That's important. I don't think it's as important as many people say. It is important, but Cignetti and his staff have only been there 1 year. They've only established their system for 1 year. So even though I think they develop at an elite level, they coach at an elite level, for many of these players, this is their first year in the system. So the entire process has not been hammered through all of these players' minds. Many of these players have not been incubated in the Cignetti system, and many of them do not have the same talent or potential that other players at different schools do have. So those are the limitations for IU, but I think they are strong, quite frankly, at every position, and they are well coached in the microscopic point of view. When you look at their starters and even some of the two deep at different positions, I think their D-line two deep is pretty good. It's the same thing at running back, where they have 3-4 power 4 caliber running backs, and I think Justice Ellison is a great running back. Wide receiver is deep. QB is deep. They have depth on many parts of the defense. I mean, this is a strong team that we have here in Indiana. They're a team that is not to be underestimated, and people have been underestimating them for weeks now. And part of it makes sense. But also, the regular season's over. They're 11-1. They're dominant in points per play margin. They're very efficient. And it's not like they have a strength of schedule that's outside the top 100 anymore. They've played OSU, and their efficiency metrics dropped from number 3, number 2, number 4 to 5, 6, and 7. They didn't collapse. They just kind of went, meh. Okay, a little bit of a recalibration here. Indiana is not a top 4 team, but they're not top 10, for example. I love Indiana. I think that they are one of the easiest teams to root for because they're fundamentally sound and because they're aggressive. And they throw the kitchen sink at you, too. That's another part of their identity. And they also have a little bit of that boa constrictor feel, where they love to run the ball for 3 to 4 or 5 yards because they don't have a really explosive rushing game. It's more of a power run game. They love to power run at you, systematically throw, use the RPO, and really control time of possession and squeeze the life out of opposing defense. And then their defense is a little bit of the opposite, in the sense that they let other teams game control them, but really in between the 20s. And then they play bend but don't break, and they rarely, if ever, break in the red zone. Teams love to go for it on fourth down against this Indiana defense, and then Indiana loves to turn them away on fourth down in their own territory. They are strong at quarterback, wide receiver, and then D-line, linebacker, and DB. O-line's a bit shakier than these other positions. Same with tight end, and running back has a lot of good and great players, but no players, that I would describe as elite. They have a great passing attack. It's very systematic, and their run stoppage is elite. They're holding teams to under 3 yards per carry this season. They limited Ohio State. They limited Michigan. They held Michigan and Michigan State, I believe, to season-low rushing yards. Nebraska couldn't run on them, which isn't really a surprise, but still, Washington, outside of a few runs from Jonah Coleman, couldn't do anything against them. They have a great rushing defense, an elite rushing defense, I would say. Now, these are strong points, and Indiana is a team that has some limitations that we already discussed that really relate to the whole roster, not just individual position groups. But I think that Curtis Rourke, when he's on, is one of the better QBs in the country. I think that Elijah Surratt and Omar Cooper Jr. at wide receiver are some of the Big Ten's better wide receivers. I think that Michael Kamara, CJ West, and Tyreek Tucker can go toe-to-toe with almost any O-line in the country. And I think that D'Angelo Pons, who's a little bit smaller than most DBs, with his jump, with his football IQ, with his anticipation, with his hands, can more than make up for some of his own physical limitations. I mean, he is the embodiment of Indiana, where Indiana has limitations that other schools don't necessarily have, but they make up for it. I mean, they persevere, they endure, and they fight. And they fight more than a lot of other teams fight. And they're one of the toughest teams in the country. They're as tough as nails. Their non-negotiable is their defensive line. I can't think of any other position for Indiana that I could classify as a non-negotiable. Like Ohio State shut down their wide receivers, in part because of Indiana's offensive line, but also they did well in coverage. Curtis Rourke, when things aren't going well, he's not really someone who can carry you through a game. It's the same thing with their running backs, tight ends. Their secondary has some limitations that I think prevent them from being a non-negotiable. But their D-line is mean. It's a little undersized at D tackle, but CJ West isn't undersized. He's one of their starting D tackles right now. And then Tyreek Tucker and James Carpenter are very impressive. And Michael Kamara is a big, physical, fast defensive end. Linnell Carr Jr. is a great defensive end. They only allow 76.2 opponent rushing yards per game, which is first. They only allow 2.6 yards per carry, which is second. And they're 37th in sack percentage with a 7.38 sack percentage. This is one of the better defenses in the country, Indiana's is, because of this defensive line, which wreaks havoc against opponent pass protection units and shuts down the run. They make you throw on them. They make you one-dimensional. It was part of the reason why Ohio State took so long to dominate IU. They couldn't run on them. So even though they were passing all the time and having a lot of success through the air, when Indiana had one play in the red zone where they love to bend, but once you get in the red zone, they do not break very often, they covered well, Howard threw it into tight coverage, ball bounced around, and it was picked off. And then Ohio State's previous red zone trip, 4th and 1, they run it shotgun up the middle, and it's stuffed. Their O-line didn't get any push. which they didn't have Seth McLaughlin, so I completely understand why that is. But I think that this Oregon D-line would defend they defend the run exceptionally well against Oregon. I would not be shocked at all if they forced Penn State's rushing offense to have some pretty serious issues. I do think this is one of the best rushing defenses in all of college football. The defensive line for Indiana is absolutely a non-negotiable, and it can help them win playoff games, make a playoff run. And I mean, heck, if they can win the national title, which I don't know if they can, but I do think there is a world where they do, very small odds of it, but I think it's possible. It would be because of their D-line, where, they shut down Georgia's rushing attack completely. And maybe if it's Carson Beck or if it's Gunnar Stockton, maybe they have time to throw. Stockton can't run, and since he doesn't have alien receivers or tight ends, he can't really throw all that well. And maybe Indiana forces some turnovers, or they get the ball to their offense several times by forcing punts, and Indiana racks up TOP and eventually exhausts Georgia's defense, maybe. Or against Notre Dame. Notre Dame has had some issues on defense, and then maybe when Notre Dame's offense tries to play catch-up or they're trying to score, all they have is their rushing offense. And if Indiana can step up and stop Notre Dame's rush attack, and maybe they can take advantage of some questionable receivers that Notre Dame has, for example. So this is a tough, tough team with a unit on the defensive line that is one of the nation's best, that is a close to an Ohio State, Penn State. I'd actually say it's better than Ohio State's D-line. I think IU is a better D-line than OSU does. Similar caliber to Penn State. It's better than Oregon's in my mind. The only units I can think of that are ahead for sure, or at least potentially ahead, are Penn State, Michigan, and South Carolina. And those are elite D-lines who are each full of one or several alien players. The X-Factor players for IU on offense are quarterback Curtis Rourke, Justice Ellison at running back, Elijah Surratt at wide receiver Omar Cooper Jr., center Mike Caddick, who has been a beast this year, and tackle Carter Smith, who's one of the Big Ten's better offensive tackles. These are players who make an impact. They won't necessarily carry the game on their own. That's what I define as alien players, and I don't think IU has any alien players on offense, but these are players who can help make or break a game. And I think Curtis Rourke, when he's on, can do that. Justice Ellison does very well at running the ball. Running back with great vision, great patience, good feet, and he has some power behind him too. The offensive line is filled with great players. Omar Cooper Jr. is an explosive wide receiver, and Surratt's a reliable weapon. Defensively, CJ West, he might be the closest thing that Indiana has to an alien player, along with Michael Kamara at defensive end. And then you got to remember about defensive tackle Tyreek Tucker as well. Walker at linebacker is impressive, and then D'Angelo Pons and Jones at the nickelback position. What can I say? Indiana's a great secondary. I think they have a defense that is close to, if not a top 10 unit. Their offense, when it's high functioning, is good too. They have the pieces to make a playoff run, and if they can make a playoff run with how weak the field is this year, if they can make a playoff run, who's to say they can't win a national title? So prepare yourselves for the unthinkable, because we've seen the unthinkable all season long, and who's to say we can't see the unthinkable in the college football playoff? We probably will. We will probably see some type of upset that many people thought was insane occur, whether it's in the first round, the second round, the third round. Maybe we'll see insanity in the national champion. We have the weakest national champion in college football history, or at least in the modern era. I don't know, but it's been chaos all season long. It's been very unpredictable, and I think Indiana's a team who can once again take advantage of that, and I think that they are one of the nation's better college football teams. So that's Indiana right there. We're going to talk about Ohio State and then quickly circle back to some more Oregon and Penn State, just very, very briefly, and then that'll be it. So just really 30 more minutes, maybe 35 more minutes, and then we'll be out of here. It's been a very long show, but I think these long shows are good. I feel good about this. Let me read some more comments here. It's going to be an epic playoff and an epic first round. I absolutely agree with that. Big Ten Quick Talk, and thank you for being a moderator on the channel. Bless me. Just had to take a breather right there. All right, let's talk about why Ohio State can win the national title. You may have thought that the Buckeyes were going to disappear off the face of the planet after the Michigan Wolverines upset them in their own home stadium in the 2024 edition of the game, winning 13-10 in a rather, let's just say, toxic fashion. It was one of the worst quality games I have ever watched. Not even yesterday's SEC championship game, which was also awful, could top what November 30th in Ohio Stadium produced. But this is a new era. This is the 12-team playoff era. This is not the 14 playoff era where, it would have been Texas, Penn State, Oregon, and Georgia in the 14 playoff based off of the rankings provided today by the committee. No. This is the 12-team playoff, and Ohio State is still in it. Analytically, they're one of America's better teams, and personally, even though after that Michigan game and after some things that I saw in the season, I thought that this team was not better than last year's team, that it was one of Ryan Day's worst teams of his tenure at Ohio State, they can win it all. The Buckeyes can. They can win the national championship thanks to a variety of factors, but I think most importantly, alien players like wide receiver Jeremiah Smith, like safety Caleb Downs, and they have good players in those same units, so they're deep, and they have a deep defensive line. Jim Knowles is one of the best defensive coordinators this year, and I still think that Ryan Day, I think the record shows that he is a good coach still. There are some questions surrounding Ohio State, and I think that their identity is shaky. I don't exactly know what their identity is, and that's not a good sign when you're competing for a national championship. I don't know if they want to be physical more than they actually are, if they believe they're physical when they have some questions along the offensive line. I don't exactly know. Are they more of a run team or a pass team? Is their coaching staff great, like we saw against Penn State, I believe, or what we saw from Chip Kelly and Day against Oregon, or what we saw against Indiana, or is it wildly overrated, like we saw against Michigan, where they came up with the worst Ohio State game plan I've seen executed in potentially my lifetime as a 22-year-old college football fan. But there are some things about Ohio State's identity that are certain, and those are NFL athletes. They are experienced. They had several players, many of whom are NFL athletes, some even potentially alien players or players with alien potential, that came back to win the national title, to beat Michigan and to win the Big Ten. They can't beat Michigan this season. Try again next year. They can't win the Big Ten this year. Try again next year. But they can win it all. And winning it all triumphs all of those. Triumphs beating Michigan, triumphs winning the Big Ten. I'm a Michigan fan. And I will tell you, as an objective Michigan fan, I would rather lose to OSU, not win the Big Ten, even lose to OSU in humiliating fashion if it meant winning it all. A national title just means that much to your program, to your pride, to your identity, to your head coach, to the staff, to his family. It means you're the best team in college football in that given season. Maybe not in power ratings, but in strength of record, in merit. That's exactly what that means. And Ohio State, on top of all those things, is physical on defense. They're, I think, one of the most, if not the most physical defense in America. And they have a high talent profile. So consequently, they're deep and they have potential at a variety of different positions that, if unlocked, they could randomly improve at any point in a game. They can have a breakout player that you've never heard of just come on the field and do something insane and make a big play because of their talent profile, combined with the fact that they do have, I think, overall a good staff, particularly on defense. Their weakness, or weaknesses plural, is their offensive line, which cannot run block and is struggling in pass protection. Their special teams, particularly kicker, and you also look at their rushing offense, consequentially from the offensive line. They got Travion Henderson back and Quinshon Judkins from the portal, and they can't run the football. Can't do it. No. They cannot run the football. And that has been apparent since the second half against Oregon, when they abandoned the run, and I think did so wisely because Will Howard and his receivers were having success against Oregon's defense. Against Nebraska, they couldn't run the football at all. Against Penn State, they could only run the football when either Penn State's defense quit at the end or before then. It was like mostly speed option stuff, where they took advantage of Penn State using man coverage, tight man coverage, and in tight formations to go to the wide side or the side with fewer Penn State players to pick up big gains with their running back speed. Brilliant play design by Kelly, but still, you typically run that stuff often if you're trying to take advantage of a defense because you struggle to run the football up the middle or that matchup is not favorable. And then they struggled against Purdue early in the first half, running the ball, eventually wore them down. Struggled against Northwestern, eventually wore them down. Struggled against Indiana for the whole game at running the ball until Henderson popped off nearly a 40-yard rushing touchdown at the end, and they couldn't run the ball at all against Michigan, much like Nebraska. Many of those D-lines, Indiana's, Michigan's, Penn State's are some of the nation's best. Nebraska's is great in my mind. Northwestern is actually respectable at defending the run. They faced a lot of great D-lines in that time, at Oregon's as well. Don't want to forget about them. Great D-line. But you can also tell that they can't do it in general. Like against Purdue, Purdue's defense sucks, and they struggled to run the ball against them at times, unless they got into open space. They struggle particularly with power running up the middle, running on the inside, and many of the D-lines that Ohio State is going to play in the playoff, if they want to win it all, if they want to win a game, are going to be closer to Michigan's defensive line. Not quite the same caliber because South Carolina and Michigan didn't make it. Penn State made it, but they're in the opposite half of the bracket, so they could only meet up with them in the Natty. They're going to be closer, the opposing defensive lines that Ohio State has to face, to Michigan's D-line than Purdue's defensive line. So that's a big weakness. Ohio State has some identity issues, and they have a weakness that is not ideal at all to winning a national title. I think that you would rather... I think that it depends, of course, but I think you'd rather be a team that has questions passing the ball but's really good at running, especially with OSU's defense, so that way it's easier to game control, than having questions on the ground and being able to successfully pass the football. This is where Ohio State, despite the fact that they have a talent profile, recruiting-wise, that's higher than anyone in the Big Ten right now, they are actually the most distant team, I think, from the other Big Ten contenders. Like, I think that Indiana, Penn State, and Oregon are all more similar to each other than Ohio State is to any of them, because they all have better trench play. And in fact, I would say on an average basis, much better trench play. None of those teams also have any type of player like Jeremiah Smith or Caleb Downs. And if they do, it's in the trenches or closer to the trenches, like Tyler Warren and Abdul Carter for Penn State. Maybe Josh Connerly Jr., for example, for Oregon. I mean, maybe Tez Johnson for Oregon as well. And then for Indiana, if they have one, it's, I think, on their D-line. Ohio State's best players and the most secure parts of their identity are in the backfield and on the perimeter. They're not in the trenches. Their strengths are quarterback, running back, wide receiver, D-line, linebacker, DB, and I would also say defensive adjustments. I think Jim Knowles right now is the best defense in the country, not just because they're deep, they're talented, and they're developed at a high level, but also because he makes good adjustments. He calls great plays, and when he sees something that isn't working, he tries to make change, and very often his changes work. This is a team that can win it all because of their defense, and also because they have an offense that can strike quickly. that even with some of their one-dimensionality, they can move you. They can abuse you. I mean, they're physical in the passing offense, something that is different from the Ohio State of this year compared to last year in passing offense is they are more physical. Howard is a more physical QB than McCord. I still think Marvin Harrison Jr. was a better receiver last year than Smith was this year, but Smith is the more physical receiver. Smith does a better job of seeking contact and I think of handling contact compared to Marvin Harrison Jr. of last year. They don't have Cade Stover, but Stover was an awesome tight end, very underrated in the sport of college football. And they're also more physical at running back. Henderson's been an amazing blocker this year, pass blocking in particular, and Quinshon Judkins is a physical running back. So the Buckeyes have gotten more physical on the offensive side of the ball, and they are a physical team nationally. The problem is their offensive line is just, it's not good. It in and of itself is a gaping hole. And you have Georgia, you got Texas, you have Oregon, Tennessee is James Pierce Jr. They're not as deep as many of these other schools, but they have an X-factor player, potentially an alien player on their D-line. You got Penn State. You have Notre Dame. I mean, Clemson's D-line is nothing to mess around with. You got Indiana. SMU's had actually a good defensive line this year. And there are probably other teams like Boise State has great pass rushers, and they have a great run defense. Having a bad O-line, especially with this bracket, but just in general because the O-line's that important, is a bad start. In fact, a terrible start to winning it all. But Ohio State is one of those teams that's so good, great, elite at other positions that they may actually be able to negate that. And outside of the Michigan game, I've thought for all season long that Ryan Day's actually done a good job of negating his weaknesses in the O-line. They did a great job against Indiana, I think, doing that. They did a good job against Penn State negating that weakness. And it's because of their running backs, wide receivers, and their defense. They have a high ceiling passing offense. When their passing offense is on, it may be the best in college football. And a large part of that's Jeremiah Smith, but also Emeka Egbuka, the reliable wide receiver, the guy who you throw to pick up first downs, and he'll always make the catch and run the proper route. Carnell Tate is explosive. He's been getting better as the year's gone on. And Ohio State has an elite defense. They have the nation's #1 defense. I mean, I watched Texas against Georgia. I did, and I'm thinking to myself, like, I don't know. Maybe Texas does have the better defense, but I'm thinking that Ohio State would at least perform at the same level compared to Georgia. And I think that Ohio State would have defended the run better than Texas did against a Georgia O-line that is physical, when healthy is one of the nation's better O-lines, but still is better in pass protection than run blocking. And ETN's not 100%. And behind him, their running back room, isn't that good. And they don't have an alien in the receiver room anymore. So Beck or now Stockton's job is that much harder. And I thought to myself, I think that Ohio State commands the nation's #1 defense. I mean, maybe it's Texas, but I think it's Ohio State. It's one of those two, and I'd lean toward the Buckeyes right now. Their defense is a strong point, and I'd say that much of their defense is a non-negotiable. Their wide receivers are obviously, specifically Jeremiah Smith, 981 all-purpose yards, 11 total touchdowns. Egbuka is a really good wide receiver. Carnell Tate has alien potential. Smith is an alien. And I've been using that term a lot, but there aren't many alien players. I mean, for Ohio State, you only have Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs. That's 2 players out of 22, and those are starters. That's not even factoring the other, 100-plus players on the roster. This defense is near elite at the worst to elite at stopping the run. I added the near elite in because part of me does think that Ohio State, just because of their talent, overwhelms people. And if they were in an actual game, their rushing defense may not fall apart, but be revealed to be a little, statistically overvalued. Because earlier in the year, and also in most games they play in this year, they're just so high flying and so quick and deep that they would just wear you down. And they would force you to they would force you to operate outside of your normal game plan. But that's at the worst case scenario. They still have a near elite defense at the very worst. At best, they may have the nation's number 1 rushing defense. They allow opponents to average only 2.9 yards per carry, which is 5th, and they only allow opponents to average 5.8 yards per pass attempt, which is 7th. And that's thanks to players like Cody Simon, Sonny Styles, Caleb Downs, Jordan Hancock, and Lathan Ransom, who occupy the linebacker and also safety and nickelback rooms. Ohio State's defense is one of the better defenses at tackling that I have watched this season. At the end of the Michigan game, the only reason they didn't tackle Kalel Mullings is at that point they were already on the field for like 8 minutes of game time. That was on the offense. Of course, the defense has to make that tackle, but a lot of that was on the offense's inability to even give the defense time to rest. So they tackle well, they're disciplined. Jim Knowles does a good job of calling up blitzes, and he's trained his players to time opponents' snaps, which is why they had a lot of success against Indiana. I think why they had some success against Penn State as well. They're well coached on defense. They're well developed, especially in the defensive backfield, and their wide receivers as well. They're developed, and they're insane. Like, Jeremiah Smith is just such a phenomenal player. He can wreck opponents by himself. He can carry Ohio State in a game if they need him to. The X-Factor players for the Buckeyes are Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins at running back, and then the 3 starting wide receivers in Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka, and Carnell Tate. Now, this is a blessing and a curse. There's no trench player, or even a semi-trench player like a tight end, as an X-Factor player. And I don't think Will Howard's an X-Factor player either. Will Howard is closer to Drew Aller than he is to Dylan Gabriel, for example, where if the supporting cast falls apart, or if the game isn't being called right, he's not going to carry Ohio State. The same thing that, like with Aller, that he won't do. Rourke, I think, is a bit better. I just think that he had a far inferior supporting cast in the game against OSU compared to Howard. And Gabriel can make magic happen. He's not like a first-round NFL QB, but he can make magic. He's an elite college QB. That's kind of the curse of this, is that the trench play has no X-Factor players. Maybe Donovan Jackson, but Jackson is outside of his normal position, and his supporting cast is so bad that I think as of right now, I question whether he's an X-Factor player as well. And the offensive line hasn't been developed well either. But the blessing of this is that you can strike quickly. And Ohio State hasn't had a ton of explosive plays this year, but they have done a good job at times of getting down the field quickly with several, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30-yard plays and getting into the end zone. They have still a pretty high red zone efficiency. It's not the same as before the injuries in the O-line, but still it's pretty high. They have great players on offense. And defensively, Tyleik Williams, Jack Sawyer, I think, are the X-Factor players on the D-line. Cody Simon is an X-Factor player at linebacker. And Caleb Downs, Lathan Ransom, and Jordan Hancock are X-Factor players in the secondary. This defense tackles well. They are physical. They, I think, are great in coverage still. They don't allow big plays usually. The only negative I'd have to say about them is their pass rush, and Jim Knowles does a good job typically of negating that by sending blitzes that are well-timed and drawn up. I mean, Cody Simon is one of the best linebackers in the country, and this safety room is the nation's best by a mile, especially if you include Jordan Hancock with that nickelback position, a part of the room that Caleb Downs and Lathan Ransom occupy. This is the nation's best defense. You combine that with the X-Factor players on offense, with an alien like Jeremiah Smith, with the talent and depth that OSU has at every position except for the offensive line. If Day can call up a good game, if he can scheme like he did against Georgia in 2022, Clemson against 2020, or like he did against Michigan in 2023, Ohio State can absolutely win it all with the talent they have, with the players that they have, and with the assistant coaches and coordinators that they have. Do not sleep on Ohio State. They are still a team who is in the conversation to win it all and therefore be the best team of 2024. So that's it that is it for talking about teams in, can they win it all and all those different things. The last thing that I will do, I'm going to blow my nose first because I'm a little bit plugged up here. But I will get back and we'll briefly, for like 8 minutes each, talk about some opinions that I have about Penn State and Oregon, like me talking about what they will do in the playoff, and then we'll be right back. So, see you guys in like 2 minutes. Just got to blow my nose. All right, we are back. Let me answer some of the chat. 7-6 Virginia Tech dominated Ohio State in 2014, then Alabama went on to beat Alabama and Oregon both. Yes, because it's about matchups, about if the proper players are playing, is the mindset of the team where it is. I think that Urban Meyer and Ryan Day are similar in some areas, except when it comes to Michigan. Like, they do sometimes, they have that thing where against the smaller competition, they don't play their A game, but against bigger competition, they do. With Ryan Day, he doesn't play his A game against Michigan, I think, outside of 2023. I think 2023 was Day's best game against Michigan of his entire career. And I think, unfortunately, because of how elite that Michigan team was, it didn't matter if he called a good game. Michigan was going to win that day almost no matter what. What Ohio State did in only losing by 6 was probably their best possible outcome, reasonably. And then because he lost to Michigan 3 times in a row, he gave up play calling because he's like, well, I want to beat these guys and I'm willing to try anything. The problem is, I think that I was originally an advocate of him giving up play calling. I don't think he should have. In hindsight, I think it's better that he calls plays, and I think what he needs to do is hire better coaches, because what those better coaches will help is they'll help with things like hire a special teams coordinator, because then the special teams coordinator can say, you can buzz down like, hey, I think we can go for a fake here and it can work, and then Day can make a decision, and all he has to do is make a decision instead of thinking about if there is a decision to make, if that makes sense. That way, Day can call the plays and do things that he's good at, but also not have the decision fatigue of being a CEO of everything. Like, it's all about delegating responsibility. And Day is one of the best play callers in the nation outside of when he played Michigan in 21 and 22. And I think Kelly was calling the game this year. I truly think Chip Kelly was calling the game. And if Day called his game against Michigan this year, they probably would have won. Maybe they wouldn't have, I don't know. But I don't think Day should have. I'm just reading a comment here, said, looked back in the past years, he's been the only head coach to play call and only be 2 kicks away from 2 national championships. Exactly. Day has been so close to being the exception to the rule, where the rule is typically coaches who win titles don't call plays. He's been, 2 kicks away from 2 championships. So take from that what you will. It's crazy. It is what it is. Football's a game of inches. Everyone says that. The Georgia Ohio State Peach Bowl is the perfect example of that. But let's talk about, for just these final few minutes here that we have, bless me, and I'm hungry, but we'll get through this. Let's talk about Oregon and Penn State and some pathways that I think that they will take. So, just gotta breathe. I don't know why my nose is plugged up, but it just is. Penn State has a massive opportunity presented to them by the College Football Playoff Committee. They lost the Big Ten championship game, but you know what happened? It feels like they actually got rewarded for losing in the Big Ten championship game, and Oregon may have gotten punished. Because Oregon has a arguably tougher path. Oregon has to play the winner of Tennessee, Ohio State, and then after that play the winner of Texas, Clemson, and whoever wins that game plays Arizona State, and the winner of that quarterfinal has to play Oregon if Oregon beats Ohio State or Tennessee. Penn State, meanwhile, they're 11-2. They're 8-1. They're the Big Ten runner-up. They're the 6th seed. And they have a red carpet. Red, shiny, laced with gold, with big, massive arrows that even someone who isn't totally blind but mostly blind can see right in front of them. And just in case they're blind, you got a loudspeaker telling you where to go. No matter what you have, this red carpet will find a way to guide you, because Penn State in the first round hosts SMU, a Southern team from Texas, in Happy Valley, in the cold, in the snow, in the wind, and Penn State's declared it a whiteout, and it's one of the most hostile environments in the country, with time travel, with different weather, and playing a superior roster. That is a nightmare matchup. A nightmare matchup for the SMU Mustangs. Then, assuming Penn State beats SMU, which they are favored to, they will play Boise State. They will play Boise State in the Fiesta Bowl on Friday, I believe. No, not Friday. Pardon me. That is Notre Dame, Indiana, is Friday at 8 p.m., Friday night, December 20th. What will happen instead is Boise State will play Penn State in the Fiesta Bowl. Again, assuming Penn State beats SMU, they will play the 30th or the 31st. It will be a night game. It will be the only quarterfinal game of that day. Boise State getting that bye, guaranteed a Fiesta Bowl berth. Penn State is going to get a Fiesta Bowl berth if they beat SMU. Then after that, they will play in the semifinal either Indiana or Notre Dame or Georgia, all of whom I think are more limited, much more limited than Oregon. And then after that game, you got the College Football Playoff National Championship. And once you reach that, we'll just play your best game, because no matter what you do, if you reach the national championship game, your season may not be a success, but there's only maybe 1% or 0.1% of cases where reaching the title game and losing would be a failure. And I don't even think this year's Ohio State team is in that classification. I don't. Last year's Michigan team, due to the midseason scandal that happened, I think was in that category. And there have been some other teams in history that have. But it's very, 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 very rare. Very rare. Penn State's not in that category. Get to the national championship game with the path in front of you, with the red carpet in front of you, which I think is an easy path. I think it's the easiest path in the college football playoff to a national championship. Get there. Beat SMU, who you are favored by nearly 2 scores against. Beat Boise State, who you will probably be favored by 2 scores against. And then whether it's Indiana, Notre Dame, or Georgia, you will not be out of it. I think that Penn State has better rosters, by the way, than all of those schools. Now, coaching, that's a bit of a different story right there. I think Kirby Smart is still much better than James Franklin. I think that Curt Cignetti is better than James Franklin, has managed games better this year. And there's a chance that Marcus Freeman is, even with his struggles in game management that are very well documented. I think what Penn State has to do is, for certain, for the season to not be a failure, they have to beat SMU and they have to beat Boise State. Now, you get to the semifinal and you lose. I don't think the season's a failure, but James Franklin wouldn't have beaten anyone with a similar caliber roster. He wouldn't have beaten any top 5 team. So I don't think the season would be a success either. If you win your semifinal game, beating Indiana, Notre Dame, or Georgia, and you reach the national championship game, I think the season's a success then. And if you win it all, man, that would be Penn State's first national title since, I believe, the 1980s. Correct me if I'm wrong. That'd be incredible for James Franklin, for Andy Krolnicki, for Tom Allen, for Deion Barnes, for Jajon Sider, for Ty Howell, for Terry Smith, for all the coaches and players of Penn State. The big thing that holds Penn State back, I think, is James Franklin. Can he win the big one? I think he can. The question is, will he win the big one? Will he win the big game? He's 1-14 versus top 5 teams, and while Penn State is competitive in a lot of those games, they rarely finish. They're so close. Like, especially this year, had 2 red zone trips against Ohio State where if they score touchdowns on both of them, they win. Against Oregon, it's the difference of literally 2 interceptions and a missed field goal. 3 plays. Last year against Ohio State, if they run the football more, maybe they win. Against Michigan, if Kenneth Grant doesn't chase down Katron Allen, maybe Penn State has enough juice to win. And then in 2022, hold on to that 4th quarter lead against Ohio State, maybe they win. This has been a theme now for several years under James Franklin. They're competitive. They're a great program. Maybe they're even a near elite program, but they are certainly not elite, and it shows in how they perform in these big games. Will they win it? That's to be decided. Can they? I think absolutely, because I think they have college football's best roster when it relates to winning a national championship. Oregon is a team that's very close. I think if you want to make the argument that Oregon has college football's best roster, make it, because I don't think I can defeat that argument. I think it's either Oregon or Penn State, the 2 Big Ten championship game participants that have the best roster in college football. But Oregon is better at explosiveness. They have the flashier roster, but Penn State's better in the trenches, and I think that's well documented from the Big Ten championship game. And a big part of the reason why they lost that game didn't have anything to do with their players. It was coaching. That's why Oregon won. Oregon won because of superior coaching. Both rosters were punching back and forth and were pretty even. And I was impressed with Penn State in the trenches. And you know what? Right now they're 4th in yards per play. They're 15th in yards per carry. They're 13th in quarterback sack percentage, 13th in opponent yards per carry, and 23rd in defensive sack percentage. Like, QB sack percentage is how many times your quarterback is sacked in a percentage relative to his dropbacks, and sack percentage defensively is how many times you sack your opponent relative to opponent dropbacks. So they get pressure on QBs, they help their quarterback stay comfortable, and they prevent him from getting pressured. They run the ball down your throat. They stuff you. They stuff your run game down your own throat. and they move the ball. Before their game against Oregon, they were second in the nation in offensive success rate. They might be first after that game against Oregon in offensive success rate. This is a elite team in 2024. This is a down year in football. I say that because the word elite gets tossed around a lot, and I don't want to act like this Penn State team, if they win it all, is one of the greatest teams of all time. They probably won't be. But I think that when you look at their trench play, they have college football's best roster, in my mind. That's what I see. O-line play, elite. D-line play, elite. Great running backs and a generational tight end in Tyler Warren. A quarterback who's good enough. A secondary that's good enough. A linebacker that if Kobe King is okay, is good enough, and I think he is. And they have just enough at wide receiver to keep secondaries honest. This Penn State team can win it all. They have a very easy path in my mind to reach the national championship game and perhaps win a national title. And the last question that I have is, will they pull it together? Just because they have not, again, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't mean they can't. That's it. It's as simple as that. They've lost 2 big games. They're still in the playoff, and they have an easy path. All that matters for Penn State now is win your big games in the here and the now. Just win out. Go 1-0 every chance you get. If Penn State wins it all, no one cares about losing to Ohio State at home and Oregon in the Big Ten Championship game, because you won it all. You won the best trophy, the trophy that matters the most. If you reach the national title game and lose, well, you beat an elite team. You beat a top 10 team, a top 5 team, more likely than not, in Georgia or Indiana or Notre Dame in your semifinal game. You broke the streak. That's success. Just because they have not won it all yet, or more importantly, won a big game. Let's start there. Let's start at something smaller. Just because they have not done that doesn't mean they never, ever can. I mean, Franklin beat Ohio State in 2016, even if he will be bad for the rest of his career at Penn State and winning big games. Who's to say that he can't pull together one once in every blue moon? And maybe this is the once in a while, or once in a decade, or once in every few years, and it's this year and it's going to be in the playoff. So the Nittany Lions can make a playoff run. Watch out for them. They're one of the best teams in the country, and their offense is high-flying. Their defense has great players, too. I'm excited to watch Penn State in the college football playoff, to watch them compete and I think win some games and make a run as well. Last but not least, I want to talk about why I believe Oregon will win the national championship. The Oregon Ducks will win the college football playoff. They will be your 2024 national champions. Right now, they stand at 13-0, 9-0 in Big Ten play. They are Big Ten champions, and they are the number 1 seed in the college football playoff. Their path is difficult. It is a difficult path to the national championship for Oregon. Even though they won the Big Ten championship game, seeding-wise, it felt like they were getting punished for winning the Big Ten championship game, which just ultimately doesn't sit right with me. It's why I think the college football playoff needs some reform. It's going to be talked about in a video that is releasing tomorrow that I want to discuss. So make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when that drops. But I think that the Ducks have handled adversity well all season long. They're one of the toughest teams in the country. I think that they have one of the best rosters in the country, potentially the best roster in the country. I think they're up there with Penn State, who they played yesterday at the Big Ten championship game. So regardless of that, for Oregon, just continue to win. You're undefeated. You beat Ohio State. You beat Penn State. You won all your other games. And they have a first-round bye, so they get extra time to rest, extra time to prepare, and that's very valuable. That means there's a lesser chance of injuries than, let's say, Notre Dame or Penn State or Ohio State or Texas, teams that have home games but have to play that extra game to win it all. That means more exhaustion, more injuries, potentially, hundreds of more snaps for, not hundreds, but tens more snaps for players on both sides of the ball. Hundreds collectively, of course, depending on the game, could be less than that. They get a first-round bye, which I think is incredibly valuable, especially with how good of a coach Dan Lanning is. He's an elite coach, top 5 in the country right now. His staff is as well. Then they will play in the Rose Bowl, in the semifinal matchup, or the quarterfinal matchup, rather, in the Rose Bowl. They will play the winner of Ohio State or Tennessee. Both good teams, but I think Oregon outclasses them both. And the Rose Bowl is in Oregon's territory. It's in Oregon's time zone. It's weather that Oregon is more familiar with this time of the year than what Tennessee or Ohio State are familiar with. For Ohio State and Tennessee, the Rose Bowl is 3 time zones away. They'll probably adjust to it. They'll probably get there, earlier than usual because the quarterfinal games are separated by 8, 9, 10, an extra day or several extra days from the first round games. But still, a time zone advantage for Oregon, an environment advantage for Oregon, and they have, I think, the better coaching staff and better roster than both Ohio State and Tennessee do. Ohio State and Tennessee have some major weaknesses. Oregon does not have a major weakness. Then they will play either Texas, Clemson, or Arizona State, depending on how that side of the bracket works out. And if they beat them, on top of beating the winner of Ohio State, Tennessee, they will play in the national championship game. And the rules always follow, with rare exception, that if you reach the national championship game, play your best football. And if you lose, the season's not a failure, because the national championship is a hard trophy to earn, and reaching that game already is an impressive feat. The Ducks have no weaknesses, and this is why I am picking them to win the national championship, a huge part of the reason why. The run defense has some concerns. I think there's a reason to be skeptical about it, but is it really a weak run defense? Because I still think it's good. I still think it's great. I happen to believe, and that's because my eyes and the stats and the analytics tell me this, that Penn State just has a near elite to elite rushing offense. It's the same thing as Boise State. It's the same thing as Ohio State before Simmons went down, and Simmons played for a quarter or two against Oregon. And Wisconsin also has a good rushing offense. And Oregon did, they faced those and they were, scratched and bruised up by those rushing offenses, but those are still pretty impressive units. So as long as the passing defense functions at a high level, which it has been, and as long as the offense continues to be high flying, I don't think it'll matter that much. I don't think this team has any obvious holes anywhere. And remember who they have played. I already told you that. Travion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins. You played Ashton Jeanty, who should win the Heisman in my opinion, best running back in the nation. You played Kalel Mullings at Michigan, held him to nil. Not that much. You played Tawi Walker. You played Jonah Coleman, Nicholas Singleton, Katron Allen, Anthony Hankerson, and Oregon State, who've done well on the ground this year. And you're only allowing an average of about 4.1 yards per carry, which is not ideal. But then again, you've played maybe the toughest schedule in the country when it comes to rushing offenses. I think that this team and this defense specifically are not as weak as some say. I think the run defense is not elite, that's for certain. They struggle getting interior penetration. I think that it's easier than against other defenses to block downfield against this Oregon unit. They're more of a pass defense than a run defense stylistically and also in personnel. But I still think they're good at stopping the run. They're a defense overall that I think is top 15. And roster-wise, they're one of the best in college football. They're very balanced. And I think that combined with coaching and an offense that's unmatched translates to a team that is going to be the first team in college football history to go 16-0. Oregon is second in offensive efficiency. They're 7th in points per game. They're 7th in offensive touchdowns per game, 12th in yards per point, and 5th in points per play. Very impressive numbers from the Oregon Ducks. This is an offense that right now is peaking. It's playing its best ball. Tez Johnson's healthy, and when Tez Johnson is healthy, him and Dylan Gabriel have a very good connection. I think it's very similar to the connection that Bo Nix and Tez Johnson and Bo Nix and Troy Franklin had last season. And he has good pass protection. Jordan James is a dog. He's a baller at running back, could be an alien player. The tackles could be alien players. I think the interior of the offensive line, while it needs work, is still good. And the tight end room is stacked with talent. This is an offense that, mark my words, is unmatched. You are not stopping this offense. You may limit the offense, but you are not stopping the offense with how it is functioning right now. And that extra rest just means any injuries they have can get cleared up. They have a longer time to game plan. It's just so many things are coming together for Oregon, largely things that Oregon can control. And that's what impresses me and why I think the Ducks will hoist the College Football Playoff National Championship trophy at the end of the year. Oregon beats others. They never beat themselves. They are well coached, and they have no crippling weaknesses. They may have some weak spots. They have things that I know Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoy and Will Stein want to fix and be better at. They want to be perfect, and they can't be perfect. They won't, but they want to be. They'll try their hardest. They'll throw the kitchen sink at you. They'll try and bomb you over the top, shove you in the middle, beat you on the outside. They'll do anything to win. They beat others. They scheme around others, and they're disciplined. They do not beat themselves like so many teams do this year. And that is why I am picking the Oregon Ducks to win the national championship. Thank you all so much for watching, guys. It's been a long live show, and I just really appreciate it. It's also been very fun. Thank you so much for watching. I am going to get off here, and I'm going to put these videos up as clips, and you'll see those tonight. You'll see many of them tomorrow, and we'll be live tomorrow with a time that is to be announced. Thank you all so much, guys. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. I will see you all very soon.